Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Living by yourself at 26 comes with its own set of rules, especially when you're a freelance photographer who keeps odd hours and forgets things constantly. The little brick duplex on Birch Avenue had been my sanctuary for almost 2 years, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood where the biggest excitement was usually someone's cat getting stuck on a roof. My landlord, an elderly man named Harold, lived 3 states away and basically let me do whatever I wanted as long as the rent came on time. The spare key under the ceramic frog planter by my front door had been my safety net since my college dorm days, a habit I carried with me through 3 different apartments because I'd locked myself out more times than I care to admit. That Friday in October started like any other, except for the weather turning nasty around lunch. The rain came down in sheets while I was shooting an outdoor wedding that got moved inside last minute, leaving everyone stressed and me soaking wet despite my umbrella. By the time I got home around 9 that evening, my fingers were so numb I could barely grip my actual key. The porch light was already on, which seemed odd since I specifically remembered turning it off that morning to save electricity. When I turned the doorknob, it opened without resistance. The door was completely unlocked. My first thought was annoyance at myself because this wasn't the first time I'd rushed out and forgotten to lock up properly, though usually I at least remembered doing it. The house felt different the moment I stepped inside, like the air pressure had changed, or someone had rearranged the molecules in the space while I was gone. The living room lamp was on, the one with the finicky switch that you had to jiggle just right to make it work, casting long shadows across my photography equipment stacked in the corner. My laptop was still on the coffee table, but it was closed now, and I distinctly remembered leaving it open with my editing software running because I'd planned to finish touching up those engagement photos tonight. The throw pillows on my couch were perfectly arranged, which was bizarre because I never bothered fixing them, just left them however they landed when I got up. Even my coffee mug from the morning was cleaned and sitting in the dish rack, and I definitely hadn't washed it. My cat Phantom usually came running the second I walked through the door, meowing like I'd abandoned him for years instead of hours. But tonight I found him crouched under the dining table, his yellow eyes wide and his black fur standing up along his spine like he'd been electrocuted. When I reached for him, he hissed at me, before darting upstairs. In the 2 years since I'd adopted him from the shelter, he'd never acted like that, not even when the vet had to give him shots. The rain kept hammering against the windows, and somewhere in the house I heard what sounded like footsteps above me, but I told myself it was just water in the gutters or the old pipes doing their thing. The kitchen was where things got really weird. Every single cabinet door was open about 3 inches, not thrown wide, just cracked uniformly like someone had gone through checking what was inside each one. My knife block on the counter had 1 empty slot, the big chef's knife missing, and I knew for certain it had been there this morning because I'd used it to cut an apple. The trash can had been moved from its usual spot by the sink to the middle of the floor, and inside were things I didn't recognize: an empty can of soup I never bought, a crumpled receipt from a gas station 20 miles away, and strangest of all, a pair of latex gloves turned inside out. My appetite vanished completely, replaced by this crawling sensation across my scalp like insects were nesting in my hair. Upstairs, my bedroom door was closed, which was wrong because I always left it open for Phantom to come and go as he pleased. Through the door, I could hear something, a rhythmic sound barely audible over the storm outside. It took me a full minute standing there in the hallway, my ear almost pressed against the wood, to realize what it was. Breathing. Slow, deep breathing, like someone sleeping or trying very hard to stay calm. My rational brain kept insisting it had to be the wind or the house settling, but my body knew better. Every muscle in my legs was screaming at me to run, to get out of the house right now, but I couldn't move. The doorknob was cold under my palm when I finally touched it, colder than it should have been, and when I started to turn it, the breathing stopped. The door swung open to reveal my bedroom exactly as I'd left it that morning. except for the man sitting on the edge of my bed. He was maybe 40, wearing a rain-soaked windbreaker and jeans, his thinning hair plastered to his skull. His shoes had left wet prints across my carpet, creating a trail from the window to the bed. In his lap was my missing chef's knife, and he was running his thumb along the blade's edge with the practiced motion of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. When he looked up at me, his eyes were the pale blue of winter ice, completely empty of any emotion I could recognize. He didn't jump or act surprised to see me. Instead, he smiled, not menacing or crazy, just pleasant, like we were old friends meeting for coffee. "You're home earlier than usual," he said in this conversational tone, as if we did this every Friday night. The wedding must have wrapped up quick. That's when it hit me like a physical blow to the chest. He knew where I'd been. He knew my schedule. This wasn't some random break-in by a stranger who'd gotten lucky finding my spare key. This man had been watching me, learning my routines, maybe for weeks or months. The ceramic frog with the key had been slightly crooked when I'd come home, I realize now, not quite in its usual position against the planter. He stood up slowly, still holding the knife but not threatening with it, just carrying it like you'd carry a book or a phone. "I've been keeping the place tidy for you," he continued, taking a step toward me. "I noticed you're always so tired when you come home. Those dishes were piling up, and the living room needed straightening." His voice was soft, almost caring, which made everything infinitely worse. Behind me, Phantom yowled from somewhere down the hall, a sound of pure animal terror. My phone was in my back pocket, but reaching for it seemed impossible with him watching me so intently. He must have seen me glance toward the stairs because he shook his head gently, like a parent correcting a child. "You don't need to leave," he said, moving past me into the hallway, close enough that I could smell him. A mixture of rain, cigarette smoke, and something medicinal like cough syrup. "I made soup earlier, it's still warm on the stove. You haven't been eating properly, just coffee and those protein bars." He knew what I ate. He'd been in my house when I was gone, going through my trash, my refrigerator, learning every detail of my life. My legs finally responded, and I bolted down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, my socks sliding on the wood. Behind me, his footsteps followed. Not running, just walking steadily, unhurried. The front door was locked. Not just locked, but deadbolted from the inside, and my keys were upstairs in my camera bag. The back door through the kitchen was my only option, but when I reached it, yanking on the handle, it wouldn't budge. He'd done something to it, jammed it somehow. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, still carrying the knife loosely at his side. "I grew up in this house," he said quietly, leaning against the door frame. "My parents owned it for 30 years before they died, and it became a rental. I still have all the original keys, even the ones to locks that were supposedly changed." He pulled out a key ring from his pocket, dozens of keys jangling together. "That ceramic frog was my mother's. She kept her spare key there too." His eyes drifted around the kitchen with this nostalgic look. "You've changed so much, but I can still see how it used to be. My bedroom was upstairs where yours is now. Sometimes I come here when you're at work and just sit in there, remembering." The window above the kitchen sink was small but maybe big enough. While he was lost in his memories, talking about Sunday dinners and birthday parties that happened decades ago, I grabbed a chair and climbed up. The window was painted shut, layers and layers of old paint sealing it like cement. I slammed my elbow against the glass, shattering it, feeling the shards cut through my sleeve. The rain poured in immediately, cold and shocking. He didn't try to stop me, just watched with this disappointed expression as I cleared the broken glass with a dish towel and forced myself through the opening. I felt my ribs scraping against the frame, my hip catching on something sharp. But then, I was falling into the muddy flower bed outside. The neighbor's house was lit up next door, maybe 50 feet away. I ran barefoot through the yard, screaming for help, not caring how crazy I looked. Behind me, I heard the back door finally open. He must have unjammed it, and his calm voice calling out, "I'll see you tomorrow then." I spent that night at my neighbor's house while the police searched my home. They found evidence that he'd been coming and going for at least 6 months. Receipts hidden in the attic, a sleeping bag in the crawl space, even a journal where he'd written down my daily activities. Harold, my landlord, was shocked when they called him. He swore he'd changed all the locks when he bought the place 5 years ago. But the locksmith they brought in showed us how some of the internal mechanisms were original, probably from the 60s. The man, his name was Gregory Dalton, was arrested at his apartment the next morning, surrounded by photos of my house from every angle, including some taken from inside while I was sleeping. The ceramic frog planter turned out to be the key to everything. His mother really had owned it, and when he saw it in the same spot decades later, something in his mind had snapped. He genuinely believed he still lived there, that I was just a guest who'd stayed too long. The police found 3 other spare keys he'd made, hidden around the property in places only someone who'd grown up there would know. Inside a fake rock by the basement window, under a loose brick in the back walkway, even one in the garage rafters. I moved out the next week, staying with my sister across town until I found a new place. An apartment on the 4th floor with a doorman and security cameras everywhere. No spare keys hidden anywhere, just a digital lock with a code I change every month. Gregory got 5 years for stalking and breaking and entering, but that's not what keeps me awake at night. It's knowing that for 6 months, while I was living my life, thinking I was safe in my own home, he was there too, washing my dishes, sitting on my bed, watching me sleep. The detective told me they found over 300 photos on his computer, documenting everything from my morning coffee routine to the way I arranged my pillows at night. Sometimes I still wake up at 3 in the morning, convinced I can hear breathing that isn't mine, even though I know it's impossible. Phantom never recovered from that night. He hides under furniture whenever anyone comes to visit, and he still won't go near windows. Last week I got a letter from Gregory in prison. I didn't open it, just handed it straight to the police, but I saw my name written on the envelope in neat, careful handwriting, and underneath it, in smaller letters, "I kept the house so nice for you." They tell me he'll probably be transferred to a psychiatric facility soon, but knowing he's locked up doesn't make me feel any safer. Because now I understand that the real horror isn't the stranger who breaks into your house. It's discovering they never thought they were breaking in at all. Last Friday night changed everything about how I see crowds, how I trust people in uniform, and why I'll never ignore my gut instinct again. The Riverside Arena downtown was hosting this indie rock show I'd been dying to see for months, and I'd gone alone because my roommate Ashley bailed last minute with a stomach bug. I almost didn't go myself, honestly, but I'd already paid for the ticket and figured why waste it. The venue was packed wall to wall with maybe 3,000 people. All of us crammed into that converted warehouse space that usually felt so intimate and electric. The opening band had just finished their set, and we were all waiting for the main act, this Portland-based group that had been climbing the charts for months. I remember standing near the middle section, close enough to see the stage but with a clear view of the main entrance I'd come through, and I was texting Ashley a photo of the crowd when everything went sideways. The fire alarm was so loud it felt like someone was drilling directly into my eardrums, those industrial sirens that make your whole body tense up instantly. People started looking around confused, some laughing nervously, others pulling out their phones to record what they thought was probably a prank or malfunction. Then these security guards appeared, but not the usual guys I recognized from previous shows. These were different, wearing black uniforms with reflective vests, moving through the crowd with this urgent, almost aggressive energy. They were shouting over the alarm, waving flashlights even though the house lights were still on, directing everyone away from the main entrance and toward the back of the venue. "Emergency evacuation, move to the rear exit, stay calm but move quickly," they kept repeating, their voices sharp and commanding. My 32 years of going to concerts had taught me where all the exits usually were in these venues, but I'd never seen security push everyone toward the back maintenance areas before. The crowd started shifting like a massive wave, bodies pressing together as everyone began moving in the same direction, and I felt myself getting swept along even though something in my chest was telling me this wasn't right. I caught a glimpse of one of the regular exit signs, the green ones that are always lit up above the side doors, pointing left toward what I knew was a proper fire exit that led straight to the parking lot. But these new security guards were herding us right, deeper into the building, toward a section I'd only ever seen venue staff use. The woman next to me, maybe college age with bright purple hair and a nose ring, grabbed my arm for balance as we got pushed forward, and I heard her ask one of the guards why we weren't using the normal exits. He didn't even look at her, just kept shouting, "Keep moving, emergency protocol, rear exit only," like he was some kind of recording on loop. The smell back there was different too. Not the usual mix of beer and sweat from the concert floor, but something stale and metallic, like old pipes and dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. We were being funneled into this narrow corridor with concrete walls, maybe 8 feet wide, and the temperature dropped noticeably as soon as we passed through the doorway. The further we went, the quieter the fire alarm became, muffled by the concrete and distance, which made no sense because shouldn't we be heading outside where it would be louder? I tried to stop, to turn around and push back through the crowd, but there were too many people behind me, all pressing forward with that mindless urgency that takes over in emergencies. The security guards had positioned themselves along the walls every 20 feet or so, their flashlights creating these harsh circles of light in what was becoming an increasingly dim space. The overhead fluorescents were spaced too far apart, leaving long stretches of shadow between them, and I noticed some weren't even working, just dark fixtures covered in years of grime. Someone's phone flashlight swept across the ceiling and I saw exposed pipes, some wrapped in what looked like ancient insulation, and water stains that spread out like diseased flowers across the concrete. The purple-haired girl was still next to me, and I heard her whisper to her boyfriend that this didn't feel like any evacuation route she'd ever seen, and he pulled her closer, his jaw tight with the same unease I was feeling in my bones. We must have been walking for 5 minutes, though it felt like hours, when the corridor took a sharp turn to the left and suddenly split into 2 passages. The security guards were directing people into both, splitting the crowd seemingly at random, and I watched as the purple-haired girl and her boyfriend got pushed into the left passage, while I got swept into the right. The panic really started to set in then, because fire evacuations don't work like this. They don't separate people, they don't take you deeper underground, and they definitely don't last this long. I could hear voices echoing from the other passage, getting fainter, and our group of maybe 300 people kept moving forward into what was becoming a maze of service tunnels. The walls were sweating now, beads of moisture running down the concrete like the building itself was nervous, and the air tasted wrong, recycled and thick like we were running out of oxygen. A man ahead of me tried to stop and ask one of the guards where exactly this exit was supposed to be, and the guard just pushed him forward, hard, causing him to stumble into the people in front of him. That's when I noticed their faces. The guards, I mean. Under those reflective vests and black uniforms, they all looked wrong somehow, like their features were too similar, too vacant, as if someone had hired a bunch of mannequins and taught them only 3 phrases to repeat. None of them were sweating despite the panic. None of them looked concerned about the supposed fire, and when one turned his flashlight toward his own face for a second, I saw his eyes were completely dilated, black pools that reflected nothing. My phone still had signal, barely 1 bar, and I tried to call 911, but the call wouldn't connect. Just gave me this weird, busy signal I'd never heard before, like static mixed with something breathing. Others were having the same problem. I could see them holding their phones up, trying to get signal. Their faces lit by screens showing emergency calls only or no service, even though we were still technically inside the city, inside a building that normally had perfect reception. The corridor narrowed again, forcing us to walk almost single file, and I felt the walls with my fingertips. They were cold and damp, and seemed to pulse with some kind of vibration, like there was machinery running somewhere behind them. People were starting to panic openly now, some crying, others shouting that they wanted to go back, but the guards just kept pushing us forward with this mechanical persistence that made my stomach churn. A woman in front of me, wearing a vintage band t-shirt and mom jeans, suddenly stopped and tried to turn around, screaming that her daughter was in the other group, that she needed to find her daughter. 2 guards grabbed her arms and literally carried her forward while she kicked and screamed, and the rest of us just watched, too shocked or too scared to intervene. The corridor started sloping downward, gradual at first but then steeper, and I could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness ahead, each drop echoing like a countdown to something terrible. My feet were starting to hurt from walking on the uneven concrete, and I realized we must have covered at least half a mile underground by now, maybe more, going deeper and deeper into what couldn't possibly be part of the original building structure. The air was getting thicker, harder to breathe, and people were starting to cough, that dry hacking sound that comes from bad air and fear combined. Then the lights went out completely, all at once, like someone had thrown a switch. The darkness was so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eyes, and the screaming started immediately, people pushing and shoving in pure animal panic. The guards' flashlights came on, but instead of helping, they made everything worse, the beams cutting through the darkness in sharp, disorienting angles that turned the crowd into a writhing mass of shadows and terrified faces. Someone fell near me and got trampled. I heard them crying out but couldn't see them, couldn't help them. Could only keep moving forward or risk being crushed myself. The guards started chanting something in unison, not in English, not in any language I recognized. Their voices harmonizing in this low, thrumming rhythm that seemed to make the walls vibrate even more. And then, suddenly there were doors. Heavy metal doors slamming shut behind us with definitive bangs that echoed through the tunnel like gunshots. I heard them closing in sequence, boom, 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 cutting off any possibility of retreat, and someone near me started praying, their voice high and desperate in the darkness. The chanting from the guards stopped abruptly, and in the silence that followed, I could hear hundreds of people breathing, whimpering, shuffling in the dark like we were all trapped in the belly of some massive beast. Then new lights flickered on, but these weren't the harsh fluorescents from before. They were red emergency lights that bathed everything in this hellish glow that made everyone look like they were already covered in blood. We were in a large room now, maybe the size of a gymnasium, with concrete walls and a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadows. Metal folding chairs were arranged in perfect rows facing a small raised platform at the far end, and the guards were directing people to sit, their movements still mechanical, still wrong. But here's the thing that made my brain refuse to process what I was seeing. There were already people sitting in some of the chairs, completely still, facing forward, not turning to look at us newcomers even as we filed in crying and terrified. They wore regular clothes, jeans, and t-shirts and sneakers, but they sat with this unnatural stillness that made them look more like props than people. I tried to resist, to stay standing, but a guard's hand clamped down on my shoulder with crushing force and pushed me into a chair in the middle section. The metal was ice cold through my jeans, and I noticed there were straps attached to the armrests and legs, though they weren't fastened yet. The woman next to me, different from before, maybe in her 40s with graying hair and a ponytail, grabbed my hand and squeezed so hard I thought she might break my fingers. "This isn't real. This can't be real," she kept repeating, but we both knew it was. On the platform, a man appeared wearing a pristine white suit that seemed to glow under the red lights, his face obscured by shadows except for his mouth, which was stretched into this too wide smile that showed too many teeth. He raised his arms like a conductor about to begin a symphony, and the guards all stepped back against the walls in perfect synchronization. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying impossibly well in the large space, seeming to come from everywhere at once, "to recruitment." My blood turned to ice water in my veins as I finally understood. This wasn't an evacuation, wasn't a kidnapping in any traditional sense, but something much worse. Something organized and planned and executed with terrifying precision. The man in white began speaking about purposes and positions, about how we'd been selected from specific demographic markers and psychological profiles built from our social media, our purchasing habits, our predictable Friday night routines. His words washed over me in waves of nonsense about corporate expansion and human resources and market optimization, but delivered with this evangelical fervor that made it sound like he was describing something holy. Behind him, a projection appeared on the wall showing logos I didn't recognize. Companies with names like Nexus Solutions and Paradigm Collective, corporate speak that meant nothing and everything. The still people in the chairs around us began to move their heads in unison, turning to look at us newcomers, and their eyes were empty, pupils blown wide just like the guards, their faces slack with whatever had been done to them. The woman still clutching my hand suddenly let go and stood up, her movements jerky like a marionette, and she walked to the front of the room and sat in one of the empty chairs in the first row, facing forward, going completely still. Others were doing the same, getting up one by one and finding empty seats closer to the platform, and I realized with growing horror that something in the air, maybe in the lights, maybe in his voice, was doing something to us. But then the real fire alarm went off. Not the fake one from before, but the actual building system, high and sharp and accompanied by the sprinkler system activating throughout the complex above us. The man in white's smile faltered for just a second, and the guards looked at each other with the first sign of confusion I'd seen from them. Water started seeping through cracks in the ceiling, and real smoke began filtering down through the ventilation system. Someone had set an actual fire, maybe on purpose, maybe by accident, but it broke whatever spell was being woven in that room. People started standing up, not in that puppet-like way, but with real panic rushing toward the doors we'd entered through. The guards tried to maintain order, but there were too many of us, and when the first person managed to break through their line, it was like a dam bursting. I ran with the crowd, pushing through the dark corridors as emergency lighting kicked in for real this time, following exit signs that hadn't been there before, or maybe I just hadn't seen them in my terror. We burst out through a loading dock into the parking lot, where fire trucks were already arriving, and I've never been so happy to see those flashing red lights that were real, attached to real emergency vehicles, with real firefighters who looked at us with genuine concern and confusion about why 300 people were pouring out of a supposedly empty section of the building. The official story was that someone had pulled a false alarm during the concert as a prank, causing a stampede that led us into restricted areas where we got lost in the service tunnels until the real fire started. The venue was shut down for fire code violations, and everyone got their ticket money refunded. But here's what haunts me. Out of the 3,000 people at that concert, only about 300 of us made it out of those tunnels. The others, including the purple-haired girl and her boyfriend, were never found. The police said they must have evacuated through different exits, but no security footage exists from that night, all mysteriously corrupted or erased. The security company that supposedly handled the evacuation doesn't exist in any business registry. Those corporations the man mentioned, Nexus Solutions and Paradigm Collective, they're real, they're massive, and they're connected to dozens of entertainment venues across the country. I've tried to warn people online, but my posts get deleted within hours, and twice now I've noticed men in black uniforms standing across from my apartment building, just watching. I moved cities, changed my phone number, deleted all my social media, but sometimes I still hear that chanting in my dreams, and I know they're still out there, still recruiting, still using concerts and crowds, and our need for entertainment to select and collect whatever they need us for. I don't go to shows anymore, don't go to movies, don't go anywhere with crowds and single exits, because now I know that sometimes the real danger isn't fire or stampedes or any normal emergency. It's the people who pretend to save you while leading you straight into something that has no name but definitely has a purpose. And that purpose involves turning regular people into those empty-eyed puppets sitting silent in rows, waiting for instructions that, hopefully, thankfully, never came for me. The night everything went wrong started just like any other Friday evening, delivering packages for one of those big companies everyone knows. My route that particular evening in late November had me covering the southeastern district, mostly residential neighborhoods and a few office complexes that stayed open late. The van felt like a second home after 2 years of doing this job, with its familiar smell of cardboard and that one squeaky wheel that sang whenever I turned left. By 11:30 that night, I had just one package left to deliver, some electronics going to an address way out near the old factories. My wife Jessica had texted me earlier, asking when I'd be home because our daughter Lily couldn't sleep without her bedtime story from Daddy. I remember texting back that I'd be there by midnight, maybe 12:30 at the latest if traffic was bad. 34 years on this earth and I'd never broken a promise to my little girl. Wasn't about to start now. The highway stretched out ahead of me like a black ribbon, those orange streetlights creating little pools of light every 100 feet or so. My usual exit, Cranbrook Road, would take me straight home in about 20 minutes, but somehow in my exhaustion and with my mind on Lily's bedtime story, I completely missed it. Didn't even realize until I saw the sign for Millwater Junction, which meant I'd gone about 3 miles too far. No big deal though, or at least that's what I thought at the time. The GPS on my phone showed a route through the industrial district that would actually shave off 5 minutes from my usual drive home. It looked simple enough on the screen, just a series of right turns through what used to be the manufacturing heart of our city, before most of the factories shut down in the early 2000s. The area wasn't completely abandoned. Some warehouses still operated during day shifts, but at this hour on a Friday night, it would be empty except for maybe a security guard or two doing rounds. The first 10 minutes went fine, just me and the hum of the van's engine echoing off the corrugated metal walls of abandoned buildings. Then the GPS started acting up, the little blue dot that represented my position jumping around the map like it couldn't figure out where I was. The signal bars dropped from 4 to 2, then to 1, and finally that dreaded message popped up. GPS signal lost, searching for connection. Great, just great. I pulled over next to what looked like an old textile factory, its windows all boarded up except for a few on the 3rd floor where the plywood had fallen off, leaving black holes that stared down at the street. The area was darker than I expected, with most of the streetlights either broken or just never replaced when they burned out. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty loading docks and rusted chain link fences topped with razor wire that had gone brown with age. That's when I noticed him, standing next to a white panel truck about 50 feet ahead of where I'd stopped. The guy wasn't doing anything particularly strange, just standing there having a smoke, but finding anyone out here at this hour made me pause for a second. He wore dark work clothes, maybe navy blue or black, hard to tell in the dim light from the one functioning street light near his truck. As I sat there trying to get my phone to reconnect, he noticed me and started walking over with this casual, unhurried pace. Something about the way he moved reminded me of my Uncle Frank, who worked construction his whole life and had that same deliberate way of walking, like every step was planned out in advance. When he got close enough, I rolled down my window halfway, keeping the engine running just in case. He had one of those faces that could have been anywhere from 45 to 60, weathered and lined but not necessarily old, with gray stubble covering his jaw and deep-set eyes that caught the light from my dashboard. "Lost?" he asked, his voice raspy like he'd been smoking for decades, which, judging by the cigarette between his fingers, he probably had. I explained about missing my exit and how my GPS had died right when I needed it most. Asked if he knew how to get back to the main highway from here. He scratched his stubble and looked down the street ahead of us, then back the way I'd come, taking his time like he was doing complex math in his head. "Yeah, I know these streets like the back of my hand," he said, flicking his cigarette into the gutter where it landed in a small shower of orange sparks. "Been working this area for 15 years, doing night maintenance on the equipment they left behind when the factories closed. Your best bet is actually forward, not back. If you try to reverse course now, you'll hit all the one-way streets they put in for the morning delivery trucks." He gestured toward my van with a hand that had 2 fingers wrapped in dirty medical tape. "Tell you what, it's complicated to explain, but I can show you. My shift just ended anyway, and I live right near where you need to go." Before I could really think it through, before I could weigh the pros and cons like Jessica always said I should do more often, he was already walking around to the passenger side. The door handle clicked and suddenly he was settling into the seat next to me, bringing with him the smell of machine oil and stale tobacco. "Name's Carl," he said, buckling his seatbelt with those taped-up fingers like this was the most normal thing in the world. "Just head straight for now. I'll tell you when to turn." My gut did this little twist. Not quite fear, but definitely unease. The kind of feeling you get when you realize you've made a decision you can't easily take back. But what was I going to do? Tell him to get out? The guy was just trying to help, and I really did need directions. I put the van in drive and started forward, noticing in my peripheral vision how he was looking around the interior of the van, taking in all the packages in the back, the delivery scanner in its holster, my phone mounted on the dashboard still showing that useless searching for signal message. We drove for about 3 minutes in relative silence, just the sound of the engine and the occasional direction from Carl. "Left here," he'd say, or "keep straight through this intersection." The streets got progressively narrower, and I noticed we hadn't passed a single working streetlight in the last minute. The buildings seemed to press in closer, old loading bays and service entrances creating dark recesses where anything could be hiding. Then Carl said something that made my chest tighten. "You know, most drivers don't come through here anymore. Not since that thing with the other delivery guy a few months back." He let that hang in the air while directing me to take another right turn. "What thing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual even though warning bells were going off in my head. Carl chuckled, this low sound that didn't contain any actual humor. "Oh, nothing proven. Guy just disappeared one night, found his van 2 weeks later parked in one of these old lots. Still had all the packages in it, nothing stolen, just no driver." He pointed ahead to a fork in the road I hadn't noticed. "Bear left here, trust me." The word trust coming out of his mouth felt wrong somehow, like when someone says honestly right before they lie to you. Every turn we made seemed to take us deeper into this maze of abandoned buildings and dead-end service roads. When I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, it showed 11:47, and I realized we'd been driving for almost 10 minutes but hadn't seen a single sign pointing toward the highway. "Hey Carl," I started, trying to keep any accusation out of my voice. "Shouldn't we have hit a main road by now?" He shifted in his seat, the vinyl creaking under his weight, and I caught him looking at the lock button on his door. "These old industrial routes are tricky," he said, but there was something different in his tone now, less helpful stranger and more like someone working hard to sound convincing. "Just a little further. Take this next right." But when I looked where he was pointing, all I saw was an alley barely wide enough for the van, with walls so close on either side that I wouldn't be able to open my door if I needed to get out quickly. I stopped the van right there, didn't even pull to the side, just hit the brakes in the middle of the empty street. "I'm not going down there," I said, surprising myself with how firm my voice came out. "This isn't the way to the highway, Carl. Where are you really taking me?" The friendly mask he'd been wearing slipped for just a second, and I saw something else underneath, something that made every muscle in my body go tense. He recovered quickly, though, putting on this wounded expression like I'd hurt his feelings. "Hey now, I'm just trying to help here. This is the shortcut, I promise. My brother actually owns a warehouse just past this alley. We can cut straight through his lot and you'll pop out right by the on-ramp." His hand moved to his pocket, and I heard the distinctive jingle of keys. "Matter of fact, I've got the keys right here. Come on, your little girl is waiting for you, right? Didn't you say something about a bedtime story?" The fact that he remembered that detail, that he'd been paying that close attention to what I'd said earlier, sent ice through my veins. That's when I made my decision. I threw the van in reverse and started backing up fast, probably faster than was safe, but I didn't care anymore. Carl's whole demeanor changed instantly, his hand shooting out to grab the wheel. "What are you doing?" he shouted. But it wasn't a question, it was a demand. I yanked the wheel hard to the left while still in reverse, causing Carl to lose his balance and slam against the passenger door. "Get out!" I yelled, hitting the brakes again. "Get out of my van right now!" But instead of reaching for the door handle, he lunged across the center console, trying to grab the keys from the ignition. We struggled for a few seconds that felt like hours, him trying to turn off the engine while I fought to keep his hands away. His taped fingers were stronger than they looked, and I could smell his breath sour and hot as he pressed closer. Then my hand found the delivery scanner in its holster, the heavy handheld device we use to scan packages, and without thinking, I swung it as hard as I could against the side of his head. The scanner connected with a dull thud, and Carl jerked back, his hand going to his temple where a cut had opened up, blood already starting to seep between his fingers. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both breathing hard, and then he smiled. Not a normal smile, but this slow, knowing thing that made me want to hit him again. "You have no idea where you are, do you?" he said, his voice calm despite the blood now running down the side of his face. "Good luck finding your way out." Then he opened the door and stepped out into the darkness, but he didn't run or stumble. He just walked calmly back the way we'd come, whistling something tuneless that echoed off the empty buildings. I slammed my hand on the door locks the second he was out, then sat there for a moment trying to stop shaking, trying to think. My phone still had no signal. The GPS was still dead, and now I was even more lost than before. Worse, Carl knew exactly where I was, and he didn't seem worried about me getting away. I spent the next 2 hours driving through those dark streets, taking random turns, trying to find any landmark I recognized or any sign pointing toward civilization. Every shadow looked like Carl. Every distant sound made me check the mirrors. Twice I thought I saw his white panel truck in the distance, always just far enough away that I couldn't be sure. Finally, around 2 in the morning, I spotted the glow of a 24-hour gas station in the distance and practically cried with relief. When I pulled in, the attendant took one look at me and asked if I needed him to call the police. I told him I'd gotten lost and had some trouble with a stranger, kept it vague because how could I explain what had really happened? He let me use the station's landline to call Jessica, and when I heard her sleepy, worried voice asking where I was, I nearly broke down completely. The police took a report, but when I tried to describe where everything had happened, I realized I had no idea. The officer said they'd had similar reports before about that area. People getting led deeper into the industrial district by someone offering help, though nobody could ever prove anything criminal had actually happened. They never found Carl or his truck, if that was even his real name. I quit the delivery job 3 weeks later. Couldn't handle driving those late-night routes anymore. Every time I passed an industrial area or saw a white panel truck in my mirrors, my heart would start racing. Jessica understood, said she'd rather have me home safe making less money than out there wondering if I'd make it back. Sometimes I search online for news about that area, looking for other drivers with similar stories, and I found a few scattered posts on trucking forums. Always the same pattern. Helpful stranger knows the area like the back of his hand. Taped fingers leads them deeper until they barely escape. One driver mentioned finding scratches on his van later that spelled out an address, but when he looked it up, it was just an empty lot where a factory burned down in 1987. Another said he went back during daylight with some friends to retrace his route, but the streets didn't match up with what he remembered, like the whole layout had changed. I don't know what Carl wanted that night, whether it was the van, the packages, or something worse. All I know is that when Lily asks me to check her closet for monsters now, I do it thoroughly, because I learned that sometimes the real monsters are just men who smile at you while leading you exactly where you don't want to go. The divorce papers had been signed for about 2 months when Kevin called me out of the blue on a Wednesday afternoon in late September. 27 years old and already divorced. That wasn't exactly how I'd pictured my life going, but there I was, living in a studio apartment that smelled like the previous tenant's cats, eating takeout straight from the container most nights. Kevin and I had been roommates at State University for 3 years, and hearing his voice after nearly 5 years of sporadic Facebook likes and birthday texts caught me completely off guard. He said he'd heard about me and Melissa splitting up through mutual friends, and he wanted to help me get my mind off things with a weekend at his family's cabin up north. The way he described it, fishing, beer, catching up like old times, sounded exactly like what I needed to pull myself out of the rut I'd been drowning in since moving out of the house Melissa and I had shared. The drive up that Friday took me through stretches of pine forest that got thicker the further I went from the city, following Kevin's handwritten directions because GPS stopped working about 40 miles back. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that my sedan barely managed, surrounded by trees so dense you couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. Kevin met me at the door wearing the same crooked grin he'd had in college, though his hairline had retreated considerably, and he'd put on maybe 30 pounds. He grabbed my bag before I could protest and gave me the tour. 2 bedrooms upstairs, a living area with a stone fireplace, a kitchen that looked recently renovated with expensive appliances that seemed out of place in such a rustic setting. The basement door stood at the end of the hallway, painted white but with scratches near the handle like someone had tried picking the lock. Kevin noticed me looking at it and quickly steered me toward the back deck, mentioning something about his dad keeping hunting equipment down there. Nothing interesting, just old gear and spider webs. That first evening started off exactly how I'd hoped. We grilled steaks on the deck while polishing off a 12-pack of the cheap beer we used to drink in college, swapping stories about old professors, and that time we almost got expelled for the prank with the dean's golf cart. But every 20 minutes or so, Kevin would pull out his phone, squinting at the screen in that way people do when they're trying to be subtle about checking messages. Each time, his jaw would tighten just a little before he'd slip it back in his pocket and launch into another story, usually louder than before, like he was trying to distract both of us from whatever he'd just read. Around 10 that night, after we'd moved inside and started on the whiskey, I asked him about work. He'd mentioned something about consulting when he called, but he got weirdly vague, saying he was between projects, doing some freelance stuff, nothing worth talking about. The conversation died after that, and he suggested we call it a night since he had something planned for Saturday morning. The guest bedroom upstairs had that musty smell places get when they're not used often, with a window that faced the woods and a radiator that clanged every few minutes like someone was hitting it with a wrench. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up needing the bathroom and heard Kevin talking downstairs, his voice low but urgent, saying something about tomorrow night and everything needs to be ready. Through the thin floorboards, I could make out him pacing back and forth in the living room, the old wood creaking under his weight in a rhythm that went on for at least 10 minutes. When I finally got up to use the bathroom, I tried to move quietly, but the hallway floor groaned under my feet, and Kevin's voice immediately stopped. By the time I made it back to bed, the house had gone completely silent except for that damned radiator, but I could have sworn I heard a car engine starting up somewhere in the distance, which made no sense since the nearest neighbor was supposedly miles away. Saturday morning, Kevin was already up making breakfast when I came downstairs, scrambling eggs and frying bacon like nothing weird had happened the night before. He'd set out orange juice in a pitcher I remembered from our college apartment, the one with the chip on the handle from when we'd both tried to catch it after knocking it off the counter. But his eyes had dark circles underneath them, and his smile seemed forced, like he was playing a character in a play he hadn't properly rehearsed. When I mentioned hearing voices last night, he laughed it off, said he'd been on the phone with his girlfriend who was having drama with her roommate. Nothing serious. Sorry if it woke me up. The thing is, Kevin had told me he was single when he called to invite me up here, specifically mentioned how we were both bachelor refugees now. Before I could bring this up, he was already ushering me outside, saying we should take advantage of the good weather and hike to the lake about a mile through the woods. The trail to the lake was barely visible, more like a deer path that Kevin seemed to know by memory, pointing out markers I couldn't distinguish. A bent tree here, a weird-shaped rock there, like he'd walked this route 100 times before. About halfway there, we passed another cabin, smaller and more run down than Kevin's, with boarded-up windows and a blue tarp over part of the roof. Kevin picked up his pace when we got near it, but I noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud leading to it, and what looked like smoke residue coming from the chimney. When I pointed this out, Kevin just shrugged and said, "Hunters sometimes used abandoned places illegally, especially during off-season. Better not to get involved." The lake itself was beautiful, surrounded by pine trees and perfectly still water that reflected the clouds like a mirror. But Kevin kept checking his phone even out there, fumbling with it when he thought I wasn't looking, and at one point, I saw him typing what looked like numbers, times maybe, into his notes app. We got back to the cabin around 4 in the afternoon, and Kevin immediately went to check on dinner, which seemed weird since it was way too early to start cooking. Through the kitchen window, I watched him walk around the side of the house to where his truck was parked, and he pulled out a black duffel bag from the bed that definitely hadn't been there when I arrived. He struggled with its weight, needing both hands to carry it, and instead of bringing it through the front door like a normal person, he went around back. I heard the storm cellar doors slam shut, the outside entrance to the basement I hadn't even noticed before. When he came back inside 15 minutes later, he was sweating despite the cool September air. and there was dirt under his fingernails that he kept trying to clean out with his pocket knife. He told me dinner would be ready at 8 sharp, that he'd invited a couple friends from the area to join us, guys who wanted to meet me after hearing so much about our college days. The 2 men who showed up just before 8 looked nothing like the kind of friends Kevin would have had. The first one, who introduced himself as Doug, stood about 6'4" with arms thick as fence posts and a neck tattoo of something written in what looked like Russian or Ukrainian. The other guy, Rodrigo, was shorter but moved with this careful precision, like every gesture was calculated, and he had these pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink when he looked at you. They both shook my hand too hard and too long, studying my face like they were memorizing it. Neither of them touched the food Kevin had prepared, grilled chicken and vegetables that actually looked pretty good, just nursed beers while asking me strange questions about my life. Did I travel much for work? Did I have family nearby? When was the last time I'd posted on social media? Had I told anyone where I was this weekend? That last one made my chest tighten, because I realized I hadn't. Everyone knew I was taking time to myself after the divorce, and Kevin had specifically suggested I disconnect for the weekend. After about an hour of this bizarre dinner party, Doug stood up and announced they should get started, which made Kevin go rigid in his chair. Rodrigo pulled out his phone and showed Kevin something on the screen that made all the color drain from his face. Kevin started stammering about needing more time, that this wasn't what they'd agreed on. But Doug just put a massive hand on his shoulder and squeezed until Kevin winced. That's when Rodrigo turned to me with this matter-of-fact tone and explained that Kevin owed them $78,000 from a gambling debt that had been accumulating interest for the past 18 months. The cabin, Rodrigo continued, wasn't actually Kevin's family place. He'd been renting it through a fake ID for situations like this. They needed someone with clean credit and no criminal record to drive a car across the Canadian border on Sunday night. A car that would have a hidden compartment built into the floor. The black duffel bag Kevin had brought in earlier contained the tools they'd used to create the compartment, and I'd been chosen because recently divorced men trying to start over were perfect candidates, desperate for connection, distracted by their own problems and unlikely to be missed immediately if things went wrong. Kevin wouldn't look at me while Rodrigo laid out their plan, just stared at his plate, pushing the untouched chicken around with his fork. They expected me to drive a modified SUV from here to a location outside Montreal, where someone would meet me at a rest stop to retrieve what was hidden in the compartment. They never said what it was, but the way Doug kept mentioning how Border Patrol rarely checked law-abiding citizens with steady employment histories told me enough. If I refused, Doug explained while cracking his knuckles one by one, they had photos they'd taken of me arriving at the cabin, my car's license plate, and they knew where I worked, where my ex-wife lived, where my parents had retired to in Florida. But if I cooperated, Kevin's debt would be cleared. I'd get $10,000 in cash for 2 hours of driving, and everyone would pretend this weekend never happened. The smart thing, Rodrigo added while sliding a car key across the table toward me, would be to think of this as helping an old friend who'd made some mistakes, because the alternative, and here Doug smiled for the first time all night, revealing a gold tooth where his left canine should be, would be messier for everyone involved. I picked up the key, feeling its weight in my palm, and told them I needed to use the bathroom to think it over. Doug started to protest, but Rodrigo held up a hand, saying I had 5 minutes to accept the reality of my situation. The bathroom window was small but not impossible. I'd climbed through tighter spaces in college, and it opened onto the roof of the back porch. My car keys were in my jacket pocket, and if I could make it to my sedan, I might have a chance. But as I stood on the toilet seat pushing the window frame up, I heard Doug's voice directly below, telling someone on the phone to watch the road, that I might try to run. That's when I remembered the abandoned cabin we'd passed on the trail, the one with fresh tire tracks. They had someone stationed there too, probably had since before I even arrived. The whole weekend had been choreographed down to the minute, and Kevin's nervous phone checking suddenly made sense. He'd been getting updates on their timeline, making sure everything stayed on schedule. I came back to the dining room and set the key on the table, then did something they didn't expect. I pulled out my phone and started recording video, narrating everything that had just happened. Their names, Kevin's debt, The smuggling plan, speaking loud and clear while backing toward the door. Doug lunged forward, but I'd already hit share, uploading it to my cloud storage with a caption about my location, and that if anything happened to me, this was why. The beauty of modern technology is that even in places with terrible cell service, videos will eventually upload once they find a signal, and I made sure they understood that deleting it from my phone wouldn't matter. Rodrigo's gray eyes narrowed as he processed this. Then he looked at Kevin with such disgust that Kevin actually flinched. They left within 20 minutes, Doug shoving Kevin hard enough that he fell against the wall. Rodrigo warning me that I'd made a serious enemy, but acknowledging I'd played it smart. I spent the rest of that night in my locked car with the engine running, driving out at first light and heading straight to the police station in the nearest town. Kevin disappeared completely. His social media went dark. His phone number became disconnected. And when I looked up the cabin's address later, the rental listing had vanished. The police said without evidence of an actual crime being committed, there wasn't much they could do, but they'd keep the report on file. Sometimes I still get unknown calls that I don't answer, and I changed apartments twice in the 6 months after that weekend, but nothing ever came of it. I never found out what was supposed to be in that compartment, and honestly, I don't want to know. My boyfriend Nathan had been gone for maybe 2 hours when everything went sideways that Saturday in August. We'd been living together in Denver since June, sharing this apartment near Washington Park, where you could hear the trains at night and smell bread from the bakery downstairs every morning. Nathan handled logistics for a medical supply company. Basically meant he drove all over Colorado, checking warehouses and dealing with shipping problems. And that morning, Phoenix called about some emergency with their inventory system. Before he left, practically running out the door with his coffee still on the counter, he asked me to do him this favor: pick up a package from his friend Tom's house in Aurora. Said they'd been negotiating about these vintage baseball cards for months, already paid for, just needed someone to grab them. The address he texted me led to this neighborhood 40 minutes away where the GPS kept losing signal, and the street names didn't follow any pattern I could figure out. Tom's house sat at the end of Sycamore Court like it was hiding from the rest of the world, surrounded by these massive cottonwood trees that blocked most of the sunlight, even at noon. The whole street felt abandoned, newspapers yellowing in driveways, lawns growing wild with dandelions and crabgrass, mailboxes stuffed so full the doors wouldn't close. His place stood out because everything was too neat, too deliberate. Perfectly trimmed hedges in perfect squares, a driveway without a single oil stain, and these wind chimes hanging from the porch ceiling that must have cost a fortune. Crystal and copper and some kind of black metal I couldn't identify. When I rang the doorbell, I heard movement inside right away, but nobody came to the door for several minutes. Just footsteps going back and forth, cabinets slamming, what sounded like books being moved around, until finally the locks turned. 3 of them. One after another. And this man appeared wearing clothes that belonged at a business meeting, not a Saturday afternoon. Tom looked nothing like what Nathan had described. Instead of the beer belly contractor type I expected, here stood this thin guy, maybe mid-40s, with shoulders that curved forward like he spent his whole life hunched over something small and detailed. His hair was this unusual bronze color, definitely dyed but done professionally. Slicked back with so much product it looked wet, and he had these pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink at the normal rate. The handshake he offered felt wrong somehow, his palm completely dry but cold, like he'd been holding ice cubes, and he held on for maybe 2 seconds longer than comfortable, studying my face like he was memorizing it. He said Nathan had told him all about me, which was weird because Nathan barely mentioned Tom except for the baseball card thing. And then he insisted I come inside while he got the package ready, said it would just take a minute to wrap it properly. The inside of his house made even less sense than the outside. Every wall painted this flat beige that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. No photos anywhere, no decorations except for these identical bronze sculptures on every surface that looked like twisted wire, formed into shapes that hurt to stare at too long. The living room had plastic covers on all the furniture like my grandmother used to have, but the plastic looked brand new, still had creases from the packaging, and underneath I could see dark green couches that probably cost more than my car. Tom disappeared down a hallway, telling me to make myself comfortable, and I heard him on the phone with someone, speaking too quietly to make out the words, but the tone sounded urgent, almost angry. Lots of short, clipped sentences that ended with these long pauses. About 10 minutes passed before Tom came back, carrying not a package but a silver tray with coffee and these small sandwiches cut into perfect triangles, the crusts removed like something from a fancy hotel. He set it down on the coffee table, which made this hollow sound like it was completely empty inside, and told me the package was still being prepared upstairs. His business partner was wrapping it specially since the cards were so valuable. The coffee tasted strange. Not bad exactly, but like it had something else mixed in. Maybe hazelnut or vanilla, but not quite either. And Tom watched me drink it with this intensity that made me take smaller sips than normal. He started asking questions about Nathan and me, how we met, where I worked, if my family lived nearby, did anybody know I was here today. That last one made me put the cup down because who asks something like that when you're just picking up baseball cards? The air in the room started feeling thicker, heavier, like before a storm but inside the house, and I noticed Tom had positioned himself between me and the front door without making it obvious, just casually standing there while he talked about how Nathan was smart to send me instead of coming himself. He said Nathan understood the situation perfectly, which made no sense because what situation could there be with baseball cards? And then he pulled out his phone to show me something. Except what appeared on the screen wasn't cards, but photos of documents, shipping manifests with highlighted sections, customs forms with Nathan's signature at the bottom. My phone buzzed in my pocket, Nathan calling. But when I reached for it, Tom shook his head slowly and said we needed to discuss what I was really here to pick up, because apparently Nathan hadn't been honest with either of us. And now I was what he called a liability in motion, whatever that meant. Tom walked to the window and pulled the curtains closed, even though it was barely 2 in the afternoon, the room dropping into this yellowish darkness from a single lamp with a shade that looked like human skin, all translucent and veined. He explained that Nathan's job wasn't just logistics. He'd been moving packages through the medical supply chain that contained things that weren't medical supplies, using his legitimate routes to hide shipments of pills that came from somewhere outside the country. The documents on his phone showed Nathan's signature on forms for containers that supposedly held syringes and gauze, but actually contained thousands of unmarked tablets, the kind that people were dying from all over Colorado. Tom said he used to handle the financial side until he realized Nathan was skimming, taking product for himself or selling it to other buyers, and now there were people asking questions, dangerous people who didn't accept excuses or believe in coincidences. My phone kept buzzing and Tom finally let me answer it, but he stayed close enough that I could smell his cologne, something medicinal and sharp like rubbing alcohol mixed with pine. Nathan's voice came through immediately, asking if I'd gotten the package yet, telling me to leave right now, don't drink anything Tom offered, just get out and drive home. But Tom grabbed the phone and put it on speaker so we could all hear. The two of them started arguing, Nathan insisting Tom was lying about everything, that he was paranoid and delusional from sampling his own product, while Tom kept repeating these numbers, dates, amounts, shipment codes, that made Nathan go quiet. Then Nathan said something that made my whole body go rigid. He told Tom that if anything happened to me, he'd already arranged for certain information to reach the authorities, that I was his insurance policy, which apparently was news to both Tom and me. Tom's face changed completely when he heard that, his polite mask slipping to show something underneath that reminded me of those nature documentaries where the snake goes perfectly still right before it strikes. He walked to the front door and turned the deadbolt, then another lock I hadn't noticed before, one that required a key from both sides, and he slipped that key into his shirt pocket while maintaining eye contact with me the whole time. On the phone, Nathan started yelling, saying he was calling the police, but Tom just laughed, this quiet, breathy sound that was somehow worse than screaming, and said Nathan wouldn't do that unless he wanted to explain the $300,000 in cash hidden in our apartment. money that apparently came from the sales Nathan had been making on the side. I didn't know about any money. Had never seen anything like that in our place, but the silence on Nathan's end told me Tom wasn't lying about this part. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls had moved in while we were talking, and I realized my arms and legs felt heavy, sluggish, like trying to move through water. Tom noticed me swaying and guided me to the couch, his grip on my elbow firm but not rough, almost gentle, like a nurse helping a patient, and he explained that the coffee just had a mild sedative, nothing dangerous, just something to keep everyone calm while we sorted this out. Nathan was screaming through the phone now, threatening Tom with names of people I'd never heard, saying they were already on their way, but Tom picked up my phone and hung up, then removed the battery and SIM card with practiced efficiency. He sat across from me in this antique chair that creaked under his weight and pulled out a second phone, started scrolling through messages, showing me conversations between Nathan and buyers, photos of our apartment building, even a picture of me walking to my car from 2 weeks ago that someone had sent to Nathan as what Tom called leverage verification. Tom explained that I had exactly 2 choices. I could take a package back to Nathan, not baseball cards, but a GPS tracker hidden inside what looked like a vintage card box, something that would let Tom's associates know every move Nathan made until they recovered their money. Or I could wait here until Nathan arrived to trade himself for me, which Tom said would happen within the hour based on how desperate he'd sounded. The sedative was wearing off faster than Tom expected, probably because I'd only drunk half the coffee, and I could feel my mind getting sharper even though I kept my body slack, let him think I was still foggy. That's when I noticed something Tom hadn't. A car had pulled up outside, engine still running, and through the gap in the curtains I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat just waiting. Tom's phone rang and he walked to the kitchen to answer it, speaking in Spanish this time, agitated, lots of no, and what sounded like excuses, and I realized whoever was outside wasn't with Tom. The moment Tom turned his back, I forced myself up from the couch, my legs barely cooperating but adrenaline helping, and stumbled toward the back of the house where I'd seen a sliding door earlier. Tom heard me moving and came running back, but I'd already reached the door, was fumbling with the lock when he grabbed my wrist, not violent but firm, saying I was making a mistake, that whoever was outside wasn't there to help me but to clean up Nathan's mess permanently. The car door opened outside and someone stepped out, a woman in a business suit carrying what looked like a small metal briefcase, and Tom actually looked scared for the first time, pulling me away from the door and toward the stairs, saying we needed to hide, both of us right now. But I didn't trust him any more than I trusted Nathan at that point, so when he loosened his grip to lock the sliding door, I grabbed one of those bronze sculptures and swung it at the window beside the door, shattering it completely, the sound like an explosion in the quiet house. And I squeezed through the opening, feeling glass tear my jacket, cutting my hands. But I kept going, running through his backyard toward the fence while behind me. Tom yelled something about not letting her see me. But it was too late. I was already climbing over, dropping into the neighbor's yard, their dog barking like crazy, as I ran between houses toward the street. My car was parked 3 houses down and I sprinted toward it, keys already in my hand, blood from the cuts making them slippery. And I could hear footsteps behind me, not running but walking fast, confident, like whoever it was knew I couldn't get away. The engine started on the first try and I reversed out so fast I clipped someone's trash cans, sending them rolling into the street. But I didn't stop, just threw it in drive and floored it out of that neighborhood. In the rearview mirror I saw the woman in the suit standing in the middle of the road, not chasing, just watching me leave. And she was holding something up. My wallet, which must have fallen out during the escape, meaning she now had my driver's license, my address, everything. I drove straight to the police station downtown, my hands leaving bloody prints on the steering wheel, and walked inside looking like I'd been attacked, which got their attention immediately. The detective who interviewed me, a woman named Reeves with gray hair pulled back tight and coffee stains on her sleeve, listened to the whole story without interrupting once, just taking notes in this little spiral notebook with handwriting so small I couldn't read it upside down. When I finished, she made some calls, sent officers to Tom's address, but they found the house completely empty. Not just no people, but no furniture, no bronze sculptures, nothing except those wind chimes still tinkling on the porch. Our apartment was different, though. They found the money exactly where Tom said it would be, wrapped in plastic and hidden inside a hole cut in the back of our bedroom closet, behind a piece of drywall Nathan had apparently removed and replaced so carefully I'd never noticed. Nathan never came home that day or any day after. His phone disconnected. His car found abandoned at a rest stop near the Wyoming border with blood on the driver's seat that turned out to be his type, but not enough to mean he was dead. The DEA got involved after that, took over the case, asked me the same questions 50 different ways, but I didn't know anything useful, just that I'd been living with a stranger for 2 years and almost died because of it. The diesel engine had been humming under me for 19 hours straight when I saw those reflective markers gleaming in the darkness ahead. My frozen food delivery run should have ended 6 hours earlier, but a jackknifed semi near the state line had trapped me and dozens of other trucks in gridlock hell. By the time traffic started moving again, dispatch was screaming through the radio about penalty fees and angry restaurant owners, so stopping at a motel wasn't even an option anymore. Every joint in my body ached from sitting in that worn driver's seat, and the gas station coffee I'd been chugging had stopped working around hour 15. The truck's heater was blasting hot air straight at my face, making my eyes water and blur, turning the empty highway into a river of black asphalt and yellow lines that seemed to breathe and shift in my peripheral vision. That exit ramp appeared through my windshield like a mirage, the curve of it matching what my exhausted brain expected to see after making this run twice a week for the past 3 years. The reflective markers caught my headlights at just the right angle, and my arms moved the steering wheel before my mind could even question whether this was actually my turn. The second my tires hit that side road, though, everything felt wrong. The surface was rough and uneven, making the whole cab shake and rattle in a way that should have snapped me fully awake. But exhaustion does strange things to your judgment, makes you rationalize stuff that would normally set off every alarm bell in your head. No streetlights lined this road. No familiar landmarks appeared in my high beams, just dense walls of pine trees pressing in from both sides like they were trying to swallow the narrow strip of broken pavement. My phone had been charging in the cup holder, and when I grabbed it to check my GPS, the screen showed 0 bars, and the map app just spun endlessly trying to find a signal. The clock on the dashboard read 1:47 a.m., and I'd been driving down this dark road for at least 10 minutes already, way longer than the usual 3-minute stretch from the highway to my neighborhood. Part of me knew I should stop, turn around, get back to the interstate and find the right exit, but another part, the exhausted, stubborn part that just wanted to be home, kept pushing the accelerator. The fuel gauge showed a quarter tank left, enough to drive around lost for a while, but not enough to waste if I really had no idea where I was heading. Every shadow outside the windows looked like it could be hiding a driveway or a street sign, but when my headlights swept across them, there was nothing but more trees and occasionally a rusted guardrail that looked like it hadn't been replaced since the 70s. Then the road started getting narrower, and I mean really narrow, to the point where pine branches were scraping against the side mirrors with this horrible scratching sound that made my teeth hurt. The pavement turned to gravel, then to packed dirt with patches of ice that made the rear of the truck fishtail every few seconds. My breathing got shallow and quick because now I couldn't even attempt a 3-point turn if I wanted to. The trees were too close, and the truck was too long. The only option was to keep going forward and hope for a clearing or a driveway wide enough to turn around in. That's when exhaustion hit me like a sledgehammer to the skull, my vision starting to tunnel, my head nodding forward involuntarily. I knew if I didn't stop immediately, I'd either crash into a tree or drive off into a ditch, so when I spotted a slightly wider section of road up ahead, I pulled over as far as I could and threw the truck in park. The plan was just to rest my eyes for 5 minutes, maybe 10 at most, just enough to stop seeing double and get my bearings straight. I cracked the window slightly to let cold air in, hoping it would keep me from falling too deep asleep, then leaned my seat back and closed my eyes. The last thing I remember thinking was how quiet everything was. No traffic sounds, no wind, not even birds or crickets. just this thick silence that pressed against my eardrums. When I opened my eyes again, the dashboard clock showed 4:23 a.m., which meant I'd been out cold for over 2 hours. My neck was stiff as hell, and my mouth tasted like something had died in it. But what really made my chest tighten was realizing the truck wasn't where I'd parked it. Instead of being on that narrow dirt road surrounded by pine trees, I was sitting in front of a 2-story house with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that looked older than my grandfather. The truck was perfectly parallel, parked along what appeared to be a proper paved driveway, the kind with those neat concrete borders and everything, like someone had carefully maneuvered it into position while I slept. My keys were still in the ignition, the engine was off, and the parking brake was engaged, things I definitely didn't remember doing. But what really made every hair on my arm stand up was the porch light being on, casting this sickly yellow glow over the front door, and there was someone standing behind the screen door, just a dark silhouette that wasn't moving at all. They were just standing there, perfectly still, like they'd been waiting for me to wake up. The worst part was how my truck's headlights were still on, pointing directly at the house, which meant whoever was standing there had been watching me sleep this entire time, probably seeing my face clearly through the windshield while they remained hidden in shadow. My first instinct was to start the engine and get the hell out of there, but when I turned the key, nothing happened, not even that clicking sound you get with a dead battery. The fuel gauge still showed a quarter tank, all the dashboard lights came on normally, but the engine wouldn't even try to turn over. That's when the figure behind the screen door moved for the first time, raising one hand and pressing it flat against the mesh like they were trying to push through it. Even from 40 feet away, I could see their fingers were way too long, each one bent at weird angles like they'd been broken and healed wrong multiple times. Then they knocked, 3 slow, deliberate taps that echoed across the empty yard, and I swear the sound was louder inside the truck than it should have been, like they were knocking directly on my windshield. I grabbed my phone again, praying for even one bar of signal to call for help, but the screen wouldn't even turn on this time, completely dead despite being plugged into the charger for hours. The person behind the door knocked again. Same pattern, 3 measured taps, and then they spoke in this raspy voice that sounded like they'd been gargling gravel. "Delivery's late, but you're finally here." My manifest was sitting on the passenger seat, and when I glanced at it, trying to make sense of what was happening, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. An additional delivery address handwritten at the bottom in shaky blue ink that was still wet and smearing. The address matched the rusted numbers I could barely make out on a crooked mailbox at the end of the driveway. 4862 Millbrook Way. But here's the thing that really messed with my head. Millbrook Way was the street I grew up on, except my childhood home burned down 15 years ago. And this house, this exact house with the same peeling paint and busted porch railing, looked exactly like it did in the old photos my mom kept in our family albums. The figure pushed the screen door open with those grotesque fingers, and it made this horrible screech that sounded exactly like the door at my childhood home used to sound. My dad never fixed it, always said he'd get around to oiling those hinges next weekend. Now I could see more details in the porch light, stringy gray hair hanging past their shoulders, clothes that looked like they'd been buried in dirt and dug up again, and a face I couldn't quite focus on, like my eyes kept sliding off it whenever I tried to look directly at them. They stepped onto the porch, moving in this jerky, unnatural way, like someone was pulling them forward with invisible strings. 28 years, they said, and my blood turned to ice because that was my exact age. 28 years since you were supposed to make this delivery, and now you're here just like we arranged. My hand fumbled for the door handle, ready to bolt on foot if I had to, but the doors wouldn't unlock. The mechanism just clicked uselessly when I pulled on it. The interior lights started flickering, and in those brief moments of darkness, I could see more figures appearing on the porch, all of them moving with that same puppet-like jerkiness. There were maybe 6 or 7 of them, all wearing clothes from different decades like they'd each been waiting here for years. One wore a milk delivery uniform from what looked like the 1950s, another had on a postal worker outfit that was rotting at the seams, and there was even someone in a pizza delivery shirt from a chain that went out of business when I was a kid. They all stood there swaying slightly, and then they all spoke in unison with that same gravelly voice. "Every road leads here eventually, when you're tired enough to take the turn." Panic gave me strength I didn't know I had left, and I slammed my shoulder into the driver's door hard enough to pop something in my shoulder socket. The door burst open and I tumbled out onto the cold driveway, scrambling to my feet as those things started moving down the porch steps toward me. But the moment my boots hit the ground, everything changed. The house started to shimmer and fade like heat waves rising off hot asphalt. The figures dissolved into wisps of fog, and suddenly I was standing in an empty lot full of charred foundation stones and blackened timber. My truck was parked right where my old bedroom used to be, engine running smooth as silk, like nothing had ever been wrong with it. The dashboard clock showed 4:31 a.m., and when I looked at my phone, it was working perfectly with full battery and 3 bars of signal, showing my location as the vacant lot at 4862 Millbrook Way. The real one, the one that had been empty since the fire that killed the previous owners back in 1995. I got back in that truck and drove straight home without stopping. Didn't even care that I was technically stealing company property by not returning to the depot first. When I checked the manifest later, that handwritten address was gone, just blank paper where it had been. I quit that job the next morning, didn't even give notice, just dropped the keys in the mail slot and never went back. The company called a few times asking about the missing hours in my delivery log and why the GPS showed my truck stationary at an address that didn't exist for over 2 hours. But I never answered. Sometimes I drive past that empty lot where my childhood home used to be, and there's nothing there but weeds and broken concrete. But once, just once, about 6 months later, I saw another delivery truck parked there at dawn. Driver slumped over the wheel, and I wanted to wake them up, warn them, but I kept driving because I knew, somehow I just knew, that whatever uses that place as bait only works when you're exhausted enough to see what isn't really there, or maybe to see what's more real than anything else. That weekend drive was supposed to be nothing more than a break before finals. We had packed the car with too much junk food, old playlists, and that careless energy you only get in your early 20s. I remember the road shimmering in the heat and the smell of gasoline mixing with sunscreen and energy drinks. There were 5 of us: me, Brandon, Emily, Paige, and Connor. We had no real destination, just a rough plan to head west until the tank told us to stop. I was behind the wheel when Paige pointed out something beyond the trees: rusted metal, faint colors, and the shape of a Ferris wheel tilting against the horizon. We pulled over near a chain-link fence half swallowed by weeds. The sign hanging from it was so sun-bleached that only the word fairground was still readable. A carousel spun lazily inside, half its bulbs dead, the rest flickering like they were fighting to stay alive. The air was heavy and still, not the kind of silence that feels calm, more like everything nearby had forgotten how to move. Brandon joked about Instagram gold, and before I could say anything, everyone was already climbing through a gap in the fence, laughing like kids sneaking into a swimming pool after hours. The ground inside was soft with old popcorn and leaves. Booths stood like hollow ribs along the main walkway, paint peeling off in sheets, prizes still hanging from hooks, their eyes faded to ghostly dots. The carousel kept turning, slow and uneven, making a sound that reminded me of a breath drawn through teeth. Emily said it must be running on leftover power from the nearby substation, but I could tell she was only guessing. There was something uneasy about how that thing turned, steady, deliberate, as if it was waiting for someone. By the time the sun started to dip, the air had cooled, and our excitement began to fade into quiet. Connor had wandered toward the Ferris wheel, Brandon was filming the carousel with his phone, and Paige was calling out for them to pose for pictures. I hung back near the entrance, feeling the fence rattle behind me every now and then, though no wind was blowing. I remember thinking I heard a faint tune, a melody that seemed to hum through the fairground, distant but persistent, like an old carnival song played underwater. Brandon was the first to disappear. We were gathered near a row of game stalls when Emily asked where he went. His phone light had been visible a moment earlier, bouncing around the carousel's mirrors. Then it just vanished. We called out his name a few times, laughing at first, assuming he was trying to mess with us. But when Paige walked over to where he had been, she found his backpack lying on the ground, one strap torn like it had caught on something sharp. No sign of him anywhere. Connor suggested he might have gone to the Ferris wheel again, though that was in the opposite direction. We split up, Paige and I heading toward the rides while Emily checked the ticket booth. The deeper we went, the more the fairground seemed to change. The air felt thick, and the lights flickered slower, like each bulb was running out of breath. Somewhere behind the carousel, I heard the faint creak of metal, followed by what sounded like laughter, but not Brandon's. It was higher, thinner, and carried an echo that did not fade naturally. When we regrouped near the entrance, Emily wasn't with us. Paige was calling her name again and again, her voice cracking a little more each time. Connor climbed onto a bench to get a better look around, shining his flashlight in wide arcs. The beam caught on something by the carousel, a smear of red across one of the painted horses. The strange part was that the horse's head had shifted since we last saw it, tilted slightly toward us as if listening. Connor swore it had been facing the other way earlier. We ran to the fence, but the gap we had crawled through was gone. The wire had been twisted back into place, rusted edges overlapping like it had always been sealed. My phone showed no signal, and every direction past the fairground faded into blackness that the flashlights could not cut through. Paige was crying. Connor kept shouting for Emily and Brandon, and all I could hear beneath it was that same distant melody, louder now, circling around us in uneven bursts. Connor said he saw movement near the Ferris wheel, so we went that way, staying close together. The closer we got, the more the ground seemed to tilt slightly, like the earth itself was uneven under the rides. The Ferris wheel stood still now, but its cabins swayed as though someone invisible was stepping inside each one. Paige whispered that she heard a voice calling her name from one of the cars. Before I could stop her, she ran ahead, disappearing behind a row of tents. I shouted and followed, only to find her phone lying in the dirt, screen cracked, camera still recording the empty space in front of it. Connor grabbed my arm and told me we had to leave, find another way out. We followed the sound of running water, thinking there might be a drainage ditch along the back fence. The air smelled of rust and wet soil. When we reached the edge, we found a small service gate hanging crooked on its hinges. Beyond it was nothing but dark highway, silent and endless. Connor pushed the gate and it opened without resistance. I turned around for one last glance at the fairground, and the lights had all gone out, every single one. Only the carousel remained, still turning in perfect circles, though I could not hear the motor anymore. We made it back to the car somehow. Neither of us said a word on the drive home. Connor stared straight ahead the entire time, his knuckles pale against the steering wheel. When we stopped at a gas station miles later, he ran inside to use the bathroom and never came back. I searched the aisles, the lot, even asked the cashier if anyone else had come through. No one had. His wallet was still on the passenger seat when I got back to the car. I left it there and drove until morning, unsure if the road was even leading anywhere real anymore. It has been years since that night. I tried reporting what happened, but the local sheriff claimed the fairground had been demolished decades ago, after an accident killed several workers. When I showed him the photos still on my phone, he looked at me like I was lying. Most of them were blank, except one. It shows the carousel perfectly lit and 5 people standing beside it. Only 2 of us have faces. I remember that night with a kind of clarity that feels unfair. Every sound, every color, even the way the air smelled when I stepped out of the bar. It's all still there. I had been laughing louder than usual, trying to seem more relaxed than I really was. It was late, and most of the office crew had already called their rides or booked a car. When I noticed Michael still sitting at the bar, scrolling through his phone, I told him I could take him home. He hesitated just for a second, but I brushed it off with that same stupid confidence people mistake for control. I told everyone I was fine, that I hadn't had much to drink. Michael wasn't just a coworker. He was the kind of person who remembered everyone's coffee order, who stayed late to help when no one asked. We had shared shifts, lunch breaks, and quiet complaints about management. That night he had looked tired, like someone who wanted the week to end already. I think that's why I insisted. Maybe a part of me wanted to feel useful, like I could do something decent for once. I remember the faint hum of the neon sign outside the bar flickering red on his glasses as he finally said, "All right, if you're sure." We took the long way home, not because it was faster, but because someone had mentioned police checkpoints near the main road. I laughed it off, saying it was safer to take the back roads anyway. The truth was, I didn't want to risk it. Pride. That's all it was. The kind of pride that makes you smile when someone questions your judgment, when deep down you know you shouldn't even be holding the keys. The first few miles were quiet. Trees on both sides, the sound of tires against gravel, and Michael talking softly about a podcast he had been listening to. I can't even remember the name of it now. Then came the curve. It's strange how a single stretch of road can live inside your head forever. Wasn't sharp, not even dangerous in daylight. But that night the air was damp, the asphalt dark and slick. I remember the headlights catching something reflective, maybe a road sign, maybe a puddle. And for a second my hands tightened on the wheel. The car drifted, just a little, enough for me to overcorrect. The sound of the tires losing grip was followed by silence so sudden it didn't make sense. Then the world folded in on itself. Metal, glass, and something I can never unhear. When I opened my eyes, everything was wrong. The windshield was gone, the radio was still playing, and the smell of burnt rubber mixed with something metallic that made me want to be sick. The world outside looked tilted, like the trees were leaning in to stare. My seatbelt had locked so hard that it felt like my ribs had been clamped. Michael was quiet beside me, his head turned slightly as if he had just fallen asleep. I called his name once, then again, but the sound came out like a whisper I didn't recognize as my own. There was no response, not even the smallest movement. People talk about adrenaline, how it keeps you from feeling pain, but that night, it felt more like I had been separated from myself entirely. I remember stumbling out of the car, barefoot, the gravel cutting into my feet, and just standing there. The road stretched behind us, empty and black. The only light came from one of the car's headlights, still glowing weakly through the steam rising from the hood. I kept expecting to see another car come by, someone who could help, but no one did. It was like that road had disappeared from the map just for us. When the first responder arrived, a local deputy, I think, I was sitting in the grass, hugging my knees. He asked me questions I couldn't answer. "How fast were you going? Did you have anything to drink tonight?" I remember shaking my head automatically, even though we both knew the truth was sitting heavy in the air between us. They covered Michael with a blanket that looked too clean, too white for that place. The sound of the zipper when they put him in the body bag didn't belong in the world. It shouldn't have existed. The next days blurred together like a punishment. Hospital lights, paperwork, the smell of antiseptic that clung to everything. My parents showed up, their faces caught between anger and worry. But I couldn't look at them for long. When the officer came to tell me about the charge, vehicular manslaughter, I didn't even react. I remember staring at his badge and thinking how polished it looked, how it reflected the ceiling light in this neat little circle. I had killed someone, and I was noticing reflections. That realization hit harder than any word they said afterward. Court hearings became a rhythm I couldn't escape. Every appearance felt the same. The hum of fluorescent lights, the shuffle of papers, the quiet coughs echoing through the room. I avoided Michael's family every time they were there. His mother once glanced in my direction, and I looked away so fast it hurt my neck. There are no words that can fix something like that. The prosecution didn't need to exaggerate anything. My own choices were evidence enough. When the judge read the sentence, community service, license revoked, probation, I knew I had gotten a mercy I didn't deserve. Life after the trial felt quieter in the wrong ways. Friends stopped calling. Co-workers avoided eye contact when I returned to the office. The empty chair where Michael used to sit was replaced within a week, but I couldn't forget how his coffee mug had a small chip near the handle. It was ridiculous, the things that stuck. I sold my car, moved to a smaller apartment, and started taking the bus. Every time I heard tires screech, even from blocks away, My body reacted before my mind could tell me it was nothing. Nights were the worst. Dreams that ended in that same curve. That same sound of metal folding in on itself. Therapy helped in pieces. My counselor said I needed to forgive myself eventually. But I don't think forgiveness works like that. It isn't something you earn by being sorry enough or by surviving long enough. Some mornings, I drive to the memorial Michael's family built by the road. A small wooden cross, flowers that change with the seasons, and sometimes a photo that fades in the sun. I sit there in silence until the air grows heavy. The world keeps moving, but that stretch of road never does. It feels stuck in the same second, waiting for something that already happened. I do not drink anymore. I do not drive either, not even short distances. People tell me I should try again, that it has been years, but I cannot. Every decision since that night has been about preventing another one like it. Maybe that is what living with guilt really means. Not a single haunting moment, but a constant negotiation with yourself to never forget why it happened. I do not expect peace, and maybe I do not deserve it. But I still visit that road, and sometimes, when I stand there long enough, I whisper his name, just to remind the world that he mattered. It had been a long weekend, the kind that drains you in a good way. A mix of bad coffee, gas station snacks, and hours of pointless conversations. My friend Ryan and I were heading back to campus after spending 2 days in the mountains. It was close to midnight when we decided to take a detour. Ryan claimed it would shave off almost an hour if we cut through an old rural road that barely appeared on the GPS. I remember hesitating, watching the black stretch of road vanish into the trees, but we were tired and wanted to get home before dawn. That road felt different from the rest. There were no houses, no street lights, not even the hum of other cars. Just the sound of gravel under the tires and the steady rhythm of the wipers scraping against a thin drizzle. The dashboard light painted Ryan's face in a strange green hue, making him look older, worn out. He kept glancing at the fuel gauge, muttering that we'd make it fine. I tried to joke about horror movies starting this way, but even my laugh sounded forced. The air got colder as we climbed a gentle slope. My phone had lost signal miles ago, and the only light came from the headlights cutting through the mist. I noticed a shape on the side of the road. Small, moving, hard to make out. Before I could say anything, Ryan hit the brakes. The thud that followed didn't sound like an animal. It was heavy, final, followed by a dull scrape beneath the bumper. For a second, neither of us spoke. The silence after the impact was worse than the sound itself. Ryan jumped out first. I stayed inside, gripping the seatbelt, trying to convince myself we had hit a deer. He shouted something I couldn't hear, so I stepped out. The smell of wet asphalt and iron filled the air. I saw the shape, pale, motionless, lying twisted near the ditch. It looked like a man, not an animal. His legs were bent wrong, and there was a torn jacket half soaked in mud. My brain refused to accept it. Ryan kept repeating that we couldn't stay, that no one would believe us if we called the police from an isolated road at midnight. We dragged the body off the road without saying a word. My hands were numb, but not from the cold. I remember the weight of his arm as it slipped from my grip, the sound of his jacket brushing against the gravel. Ryan kept whispering that it was the only way, that if anyone drove by and saw us, it would look worse than it was. We pushed him into the ditch, and I caught a glimpse of his face, half covered in mud, one eye open. It didn't look like a person anymore, just something broken and empty. I forced myself to look away. The drive after that felt endless. Neither of us spoke. The rain got heavier, washing away the blood that had splattered on the hood. Every time the wipers moved, I saw flashes of that face in the streaked glass. Ryan's jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful. He said he would take the car to a friend's garage the next morning, get the bumper fixed, and no one would ever know. I wanted to believe him, but I could still smell the metallic air every time I breathed in. Sleep that night felt impossible. 2 days later, the sound of knocking woke me up before sunrise. When I looked out my window, there was a police cruiser parked by the curb. My chest tightened as I watched 2 officers walk toward Ryan's house across the street. We had grown up in the same neighborhood, just a few houses apart. They talked to him for a while, then one of them pointed toward my place. Moments later, there was a knock on my own door. The officer said they were investigating a hit and run on that same road we had taken. A man had been found dead in a ditch. The words barely made sense as he spoke them. He said the man had survived a motorcycle crash and was trying to crawl for help when we hit him. The security camera at a small gas station had caught our car passing through minutes before the incident. They wanted both of us to come down to the station for questioning. Ryan looked like a ghost when we saw each other there. He kept rubbing his temples, muttering that it was an accident. The detective didn't say much, but his expression said everything. He knew we had seen that it was a man. Ryan was charged first. His fingerprints were found on the hood, and the paint samples matched the traces from the victim's clothes. When they questioned me, I told them the truth, at least most of it. I said we thought it was an animal, that everything happened too fast. They wrote it all down without looking up. When the interview ended, the officer said something that stuck with me. Panic doesn't erase responsibility. Those words played over and over in my head for days afterward, louder than any siren could have been. The media got hold of the story soon after. Headlines called it a tragic accident, but online, people had their own version. Two careless students who ran from what they'd done. My phone filled with messages from classmates pretending to check in just to get details. Ryan stopped answering my calls. His parents moved him out of the dorms before the semester ended. I kept going to class, pretending to focus, but every time a car passed too close, I flinched. Every night, I heard the sound of that impact in my dreams. Months went by and the case faded from the news. Ryan's lawyer managed to negotiate a plea deal. I was classified as a witness, not an accomplice, but it did not feel like I deserved the distance that label gave me. I avoided that road whenever I drove home. One evening, I took the long route through the city, and still, at one stoplight, I saw a man on the shoulder, limping under the flickering yellow light. It was just a stranger, probably someone fixing his car, but I could not breathe until the light turned green. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I sometimes wonder if the man we hit had seen our headlights coming, if he raised his hand, hoping we would stop. I never asked the police for details. I did not want to know his name or the town he was from. It feels wrong to attach a full story to someone whose ending I helped write. The truth is, the silence afterward was not just fear. It was shame, the kind that lingers long after punishment ends. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. November in Oregon means darkness creeps in before dinner, and that Wednesday was no exception. I'd just finished my last class at Portland State, a 3-hour seminar on Victorian literature that always left my brain feeling like mush. And all I wanted was to get home, make some ramen and crash on the couch with Netflix. My roommate Kelsey had gone to her parents' place in Eugene for the week. Something about her mom's birthday, so I had the whole rental house to myself. We'd been living in that little 2-bedroom place near Belmont for about 6 months. One of those old craftsman houses from the 20s, with creaky floors and windows that rattled whenever a bus drove by. My parents kept asking if I felt safe living there, especially with all the break-ins happening around campus lately. But honestly, I loved that house. It had character, you know? Original hardwood floors, this gorgeous built-in bookshelf in the living room, and a huge backyard with an apple tree that actually produced edible fruit. Walking up the front steps around 5:10, I remember thinking how weird it was that the porch light wasn't on. I was pretty sure I'd flipped it that morning, but maybe I'd forgotten in my rush to catch the bus. My keys jangled as I fumbled with the lock in the growing darkness, and when I pushed open the door, the house felt different somehow. Not wrong exactly, just different. Like when you walk into a room and everyone stops talking, that kind of heavy silence. I dropped my backpack by the door and reached for the light switch, squinting as the overhead fixture flooded the entryway with harsh yellow light. My sneakers squeaked on the hardwood as I headed toward the kitchen, already mentally debating between chicken or shrimp-flavored ramen, when I noticed my bedroom door at the end of the hall was open. Not wide open, just cracked about 6 inches, enough to see the fading daylight filtering through my window. That gave me pause because I'm obsessive about closing doors. Always have been since I was a kid. My older brother used to tease me about it, calling me the door police whenever I'd go around the house making sure everything was shut tight before bed. I stood there for a second, telling myself maybe I'd been in a rush that morning, maybe I hadn't pulled it all the way closed. But then I saw them, my curtains, the thick burgundy ones I'd bought at Target specifically because they blocked out the morning sun. They were open about a foot in the middle, creating this narrow gap where anyone walking by could see straight into my room. I definitely, absolutely, 100% had closed those before leaving. I remember doing it because I'd noticed my neighbor across the way, this guy who worked nights at the hospital, getting home right as I was getting ready, and I didn't want him seeing me change. My phone buzzed in my pocket, that specific double vibration that meant the security camera app was sending an alert. Kelsey's dad had installed this cheap camera system when we moved in. Nothing fancy, just a doorbell cam and one overlooking the driveway. The notification read "Person detected at front door," which seemed weird since I'd just walked through there myself. Then another buzz, "Motion detected in driveway." Another, "Multiple persons detected." My throat tightened as I opened the app, waiting for it to load. But instead of showing me the live feed, it just spun and spun before displaying "Camera offline." I tried refreshing it, even closed the app completely and reopened it, but got the same message. The timestamp showed it had gone offline at exactly 5:14, about 3 minutes after I'd walked through the door. I moved toward the kitchen, every nerve in my body suddenly awake and screaming at me to pay attention. The house was too quiet, that kind of thick silence where you can hear your own heartbeat thudding in your ears. I reached for the kitchen light switch, and as the fluorescent tubes flickered to life, I caught movement outside the window above the sink. Just a flash of something dark against the fence line. I stepped closer to the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to block the glare from the overhead light. And that's when I saw him. A man standing in my backyard, positioned right behind the apple tree facing the house. He wasn't moving, wasn't trying to hide, just standing there with his arms at his sides like he was waiting for something. The last traces of daylight made him more silhouette than person, but I could tell he was tall, wearing what looked like a dark hoodie, and he was definitely watching my house. My first instinct was to duck down below the window, which I did, practically throwing myself onto the linoleum floor. I crawled on my hands and knees to the hallway, my mind racing through options. Call 911, run out the front door, lock myself in the bathroom. From my position on the floor, I could see straight through to my bedroom, and with the lights now on in the kitchen and hallway, the window had turned into a perfect mirror. But I knew what that meant from the outside looking in. Before I'd turned on the lights, anyone in that backyard could see everything inside my room through that gap in the curtains. They'd probably watched me walk through the house, seen me go to the kitchen, knew exactly where I was. My fingers fumbled with my phone as I dialed 911, trying to keep my voice steady as I whispered my address to the dispatcher. While I was on the phone with the dispatcher, explaining in a shaky whisper that someone was in my backyard, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the sliding glass door in the dining room being tested. That specific metallic rattle it made when you pulled on it while it was locked. I'd locked it that morning, right? God, I'd locked it, I was sure I had. The dispatcher was asking me questions, her voice calm and professional. But all I could focus on was that sound. Then it stopped. Everything went quiet again except for my own ragged breathing. I pressed myself against the wall in the hallway, phone clutched to my ear, when I heard footsteps on the back deck, slow and deliberate, moving from the sliding door toward the kitchen window. He was checking every possible entry point, and he wasn't even trying to be quiet about it. Like he wanted me to know he was there, wanted me to hear him looking for a way in. The dispatcher told me units were on their way, maybe 4 minutes out, to stay on the line and find somewhere safe to lock myself in. 4 minutes might as well have been 4 hours. I started crawling toward the bathroom, the only room in the house with a lock that actually worked properly, when I heard something that made me stop cold. Voices, plural. There was more than one person out there. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded like 2 distinct male voices having a conversation in my backyard. Casual as could be, like they were discussing weekend plans instead of breaking into someone's home. Then I heard one of them laugh, this short, sharp bark of a sound that made bile rise in my throat. They weren't nervous or rushed. They were enjoying this. I made it to the bathroom and quietly closed the door, turning the lock as slowly as possible to minimize the click. The dispatcher was still talking, telling me to stay calm, that officers were close, but her voice sounded distant and tinny through the phone speaker. I sat on the cold tile floor with my back against the bathtub, knees pulled up to my chest, trying to control my breathing. Then came the sound I'd been dreading, breaking glass. Not loud and dramatic like in movies, but a careful, deliberate crack, followed by the tinkling of pieces being removed. They were coming in through my bedroom window, the one with the curtains they'd deliberately left open. I could hear them clearly now, one of them saying something about watching for neighbors, the other responding that the street was empty. Their voices were so calm, so matter-of-fact, like they'd done this 100 times before. The footsteps inside my house made a different sound than mine ever did. Heavier, more purposeful, accompanied by the creak of floorboards I didn't even know could creak. I heard dresser drawers being pulled open in my bedroom, the contents dumped out, then the closet door banging against the wall. They were looking for specific things, valuable things, and they were moving fast now. One set of footsteps headed toward Kelsey's room, while the other moved down the hallway toward where I was hiding. The bathroom doorknob rattled. Just once, a quick test to see if it was locked. I held my breath, my entire body rigid with fear, the dispatcher's voice a distant mumble I could barely process. The footsteps paused right outside the door. I could see the shadow of feet in the gap underneath, 2 dark shapes against the hallway light. He stood there for what felt like forever but was probably only 10 seconds. Then I heard him say to his partner, "She's in here." Not a question. A statement. He knew exactly where I was. That's when the sirens started, faint at first, but growing louder by the second. The feet under my door shifted immediately, and I heard the guy curse, something sharp and angry. His partner called out from the other room, just one word, "Go!" The footsteps pounded back down the hallway, no longer trying to be quiet, and I heard them scrambling through my bedroom. Something heavy fell and crashed, probably my lamp, then more glass crunching under their feet as they went back out the window. The sirens were screaming now, definitely on my street, and through the small bathroom window I could see red and blue lights painting the walls. I stayed frozen on that bathroom floor, couldn't move even when I heard the police officers announcing themselves at the front door. The dispatcher kept telling me it was safe, that I could come out, but my legs wouldn't work. It took 2 officers calling my name through the door before I finally managed to unlock it, and when I saw them standing there in their uniforms, I completely broke down. Later, after giving my statement and watching crime scene techs dust my bedroom window for prints, one of the detectives pulled me aside. Detective Hobbs, an older woman with gray streaks in her hair and tired eyes, told me I was lucky. They'd been tracking this crew for 3 weeks, she said. 5 guys working together, specifically targeting young women living alone or with female roommates. They'd scout the houses for days, learn the routines, wait for that perfect window right at dusk when people got home from work or school. The darkness gave them cover, but more importantly, that's when people turn on their lights without thinking to close their blinds first, turning their windows into one-way glass. You can't see out, but anyone outside can see everything in. They'd hit 7 houses already, always entering through bedrooms, always when the victim was home but isolated in another part of the house. The crew would panic and run if they heard sirens, which is the only reason I wasn't face-to-face with them that night. Detective Hobbs said they caught 2 of them 3 blocks away, still had jewelry from my bedroom in their pockets. The others got away, but with the evidence they found, it was enough to connect them to all the other break-ins. She kept saying I did everything right, calling 911 immediately, hiding, staying on the line. But all I could think about was those 10 seconds when he stood outside my bathroom door, knowing I was there, deciding what to do next. October in small-town Indiana brings out everyone for the annual Fall Festival, and that Saturday was no exception. I'd been running the ticket booth at Garrett's farm since noon, watching families stream through with their kids dressed in costumes even though Halloween was still 2 weeks away. My daughter Chloe had just turned 7 that September, and she'd been begging me all week to let her go through the corn maze with her friend Alyssa from school. Around 4:30, when my shift was almost over, I finally caved and told them they could go while I finished counting the register. Garrett's maze was famous in our county. 10 acres of corn designed by some company from Chicago that specialized in these things, with paths that twisted and split into dead ends that even adults got lost in for an hour sometimes. Alyssa's mom, Beverly, had volunteered to walk them through while I wrapped up my shift, and I watched them disappear into the entrance, Chloe's purple jacket bright against the browning corn stalks. Beverly was the type of parent who had GPS trackers in her kids' shoes and made them wear helmets to ride scooters in their own driveway, so I figured if anyone would keep them safe, it would be her. I could hear the festival winding down around me, vendors starting to pack up their crafts, the band on the main stage announcing their last song, and I remember thinking we'd timed it perfectly because the maze closed at 5 and we'd missed the parking lot chaos. I was wiping down the counter when Beverly came running toward me, her face completely drained of color, asking if Chloe had come back to find me. She explained in this rapid, breathless way that they'd been about halfway through the maze when Chloe said she needed to use the bathroom really badly. Beverly told her to wait just 5 more minutes until they got out. But Chloe was doing that dance kids do when they really can't hold it, so Beverly pointed to the exit sign they could see above the corn, maybe 50 feet away through the stalks. She told Chloe to walk straight toward it while she kept Alyssa with her on the path, figuring they'd meet at the exit in 2 minutes max. But when Beverly and Alyssa came out, Chloe wasn't there, and the teenage worker at the exit said no kid in a purple jacket had come through. Beverly ran back into the maze, calling for her, then came to find me, certain Chloe must have gotten turned around and found her way back to the ticket booth somehow. We got the maze supervisor, a guy named Carl who'd worked at Garrett's for 15 years, and he immediately called all 5 workers stationed inside the maze on their walkie-talkies. None of them had seen a little girl in purple, but Carl didn't panic, just switched to his manager voice and told them to do a systematic sweep, starting from the exit and working backwards. He explained to me that kids got separated from their parents at least twice a day during peak season. Usually they just sat down and cried until someone found them. Never took more than 10 minutes to locate them. But 20 minutes passed, then 30, and the workers kept radioing back with nothing. No sign of her anywhere, not even crying or calling out, and I could see Carl starting to sweat through his flannel shirt, even though the temperature had dropped to maybe 60 degrees. By 5:15, Carl had called the police and shut down the entire festival. Nobody in or out, and they'd brought in everyone who worked at the farm plus volunteers from the crowd to form a human chain through the maze. We walked slowly, arms stretched out, touching the corn on both sides, making sure we didn't miss any small paths or spots where a kid might have curled up. The sun was setting fast, that October light that goes from golden to dark in what feels like minutes, and people had their phone flashlights out, calling Chloe's name over and over until our voices went hoarse. I kept expecting to hear someone shout that they'd found her. Maybe scared, but okay. Maybe she'd fallen asleep somehow, even though that made no sense. But the shouts never came, just more voices joining the search as word spread through the crowd of remaining festival goers. The police brought in dogs around 6, 2 German shepherds that specialized in tracking, and they had me give them Chloe's sweater from my car to get her scent. Watching those dogs work through the maze, their handlers following with heavy-duty flashlights, made everything feel suddenly official and terrifying, in a way that knocked the wind out of me. They traced her path from the entrance, following the exact route Beverly had described. Then the dog stopped at this spot maybe 40 feet from the exit, circling and whining, and the handler said this was where her trail went cold, just completely disappeared. He kept using phrases like scent cone and track contamination, but what he was really saying was that Chloe's smell just stopped existing at that spot, like she'd been lifted straight up into the air. The detective in charge, a woman named Diane Foster who had kids of her own and kept touching my shoulder while she talked, told me they needed to review the security footage immediately. Garrett's farm had installed cameras 2 years earlier after someone tried to sue them over a broken ankle, mostly covering the main areas where liability issues might happen. We huddled in the farm's office, this cramped room that smelled like fertilizer and old coffee, watching grainy footage on a monitor from the camera that covered the maze exit and part of the parking area. Detective Foster fast-forwarded through hours of families going in and out, kids running around, until we got to 5:02 p.m., just after the maze closed, and she told me to watch carefully. At first it just looked like the usual end-of-day crowd, people heading to their cars with tired kids and bags of kettle corn, everyone bundled up as the evening got colder. Then Foster pointed at the screen and rewound it, playing the same 15 seconds over and over, and I saw what she was watching. This person walking out of the maze's exit carrying what looked like a heavy bundle wrapped in a barn jacket, the red and black plaid kind half the men in town owned. The figure kept their head down, a baseball cap pulled low, moving with the crowd but somehow separate from it, walking steadily toward the parking lot while everyone else was stopping to chat or wrestle kids into car seats. The bundle in their arms was the size of a child, covered completely except for what might have been a small foot in a pink sneaker hanging out at one corner, and I heard myself make this sound. Not quite a scream, but close. Foster had her tech guy enhance the footage as much as possible, but the person had clearly known where the cameras were, keeping their face angled away, using the crowd as cover. They'd timed it perfectly, walking out just as a church youth group was leaving. 30 or 40 teenagers all bunched together, making it impossible to track where the figure went once they hit the parking lot. The other cameras showed fragments, a shoulder here, the edge of the bundle there, but never a clear shot of the person's face or their vehicle. Foster pulled up footage from earlier in the day, trying to find someone casing the maze, watching for kids, and that's when she found something that made her call in the FBI. These 3 other incidents at fall festivals in surrounding states over the past 4 years, all of them with the same pattern. Each time it was a small-town festival with a corn maze, always in October when the crowds were biggest, and daylight was fading by late afternoon. A child between 6 and 8 would vanish inside the maze just before closing time, and security footage would show someone carrying a bundle out, blending with the crowd, impossible to identify. In 2 cases, the children were found within 48 hours, dropped at rest stops hundreds of miles away, traumatized but physically unharmed, with no memory of what happened after someone approached them in the maze holding a cloth that smelled sweet. The 3rd child, a boy from Ohio, was never found, and his case had been cold for 2 years. Foster showed me the footage from those festivals, and even though the images were from different states, different years, the way the person moved was identical. That same deliberate walk, the same way of holding the bundle, like they'd practiced it. The FBI set up a command center in Garrett's barn, agents arriving within 3 hours, treating the whole farm like a crime scene. They had software that analyzed the figure's gait and body proportions, determining it was likely a man between 5'10" and 6 feet tall, athletic build based on how easily he carried the weight. They tracked every vehicle that left the parking lot using traffic cameras from town. But there were over 300 cars, and the suspect had probably switched vehicles or had fake plates ready. While they worked, I sat in the police station with Beverly, who couldn't stop crying and blaming herself, saying she should have just let Chloe pee in the corn. Dignity didn't matter. Why did she care about stupid rules when her job was to protect my child? Around midnight, an agent told us they'd received a tip from a gas station attendant in Kentucky who'd seen a man buy supplies around 7 p.m., acting nervous, with what sounded like a child crying in his van. They found Chloe at a rest stop near Louisville at 3 in the morning, sitting on a bench by the vending machines, still wearing her purple jacket but dizzy and confused. The doctors said she'd been drugged with something that affected her memory. Probably chloroform initially, then something else to keep her quiet during the drive. She remembered walking toward the maze exit, then someone calling her name, saying her mom had sent them to get her, and after that just fragments, the smell of pine air freshener, country music playing low, stopping somewhere with bright lights. The man had left her with a juice box and a note in her pocket that just said "Lucky Number 2, which made the FBI agents exchange looks that told me we'd gotten unbelievably fortunate. They never caught him, though they connected him to 7 different attempts over 6 years, realizing he'd gotten better at it over time, learned exactly how to exploit those busy October evenings when tired parents and overwhelmed workers created just enough chaos for him to operate. My parents both worked at the medical center downtown, which meant they never made it home before 6:30, sometimes 7 if traffic on Highway 94 backed up. Being 17 and having my license for barely 8 months, I drove myself to school and got home every day around 3:30 to an empty house. My older sister had moved into her college dorm in August, so for the first time ever I had nearly 3 hours of complete solitude every weekday afternoon. I'd usually heat up whatever mom left in the fridge, scroll through my phone at the kitchen counter, then head upstairs to finish homework or play games until I heard the garage door rumble open. We lived on Cedar Ridge Drive, one of those streets where people still hung American flags year-round, and the biggest excitement was when the Johnsons got their driveway repaved in September. Normal, boring, safe, exactly the kind of place where you wouldn't expect to discover someone had been living in your basement. Monday afternoon felt routine when I walked through the front door, tossed my keys on the hall table, and headed to the kitchen for food. While waiting for the microwave to finish heating my leftover chicken and rice, I noticed the basement door standing open maybe 2 inches, just enough to see darkness beyond. Dad always insisted we keep it closed to save on heating costs, especially now that November had brought that sharp Minnesota cold that made your nose hurt when you breathed too deep. I pushed it shut without much thought, assuming Mom had grabbed something from the freezer downstairs before leaving for work that morning. 20 minutes later, after finishing my food and heading to the garage for a Dr. Pepper, I walked past the door again and saw light seeping out from the gap at the bottom, a thin yellow line against the dark hardwood floor. I stood there for a second, staring at that strip of light and trying to remember if I'd actually seen darkness when I closed the door earlier, or if my brain had just filled in what I expected to see. The switch for the basement light sat at the top of the stairs, so someone would have had to flip it after I shut the door. Maybe Dad had installed one of those timer things he'd been talking about, something about saving electricity, though it seemed weird to put it on the basement lights that nobody used during the day. I opened the door, reached around the frame to hit the switch, and heard the click as the light turned off. The basement went black, that thick kind of darkness that seemed to press against your eyes. I closed the door again, made sure it latched properly this time, and headed upstairs to my room. Wednesday brought the same thing, except this time I knew for certain the lights had been off when I first closed the door, because I'd specifically checked. After school, I found the door open again, maybe 3 inches this time, enough that I could see the wooden stairs descending into shadows. No light this time, but when I went to close it, I caught a smell drifting up from below, something musty mixed with what reminded me of the camping gear Dad stored in the garage, that synthetic sleeping bag smell. I actually went halfway down the stairs, squinting in the dim light from the doorway, trying to see if maybe a pipe had burst, or if we had water damage somewhere. Everything looked normal from what I could tell, just the usual basement stuff like the old couch we'd replaced last year, cardboard boxes labeled with my sister's name, the ancient treadmill Mom kept swearing she'd start using again. By Friday, I'd started taking pictures with my phone every time I closed the door, just to prove to myself I wasn't going crazy. At 3:42 p.m., I had a photo showing the door completely shut, the white paint of the door frame visible on all sides. At 4:15 p.m., when I came downstairs to grab my charger from the living room, the door stood wide open, probably 6 inches, and I could hear something that made me stop dead in the hallway. Footsteps, or what sounded like footsteps. That slow, careful kind, when someone's trying to be quiet on creaky floorboards. Our basement had this old linoleum floor that made a specific sticky sound when you walked on it, like peeling tape off paper, and that's exactly what I heard echoing up from the darkness. My first thought wasn't even about an intruder, honestly, because that seemed impossible in our neighborhood, where Mrs. Patterson across the street practically ran a surveillance operation from her living room window. I convinced myself we had some kind of animal problem, maybe a raccoon that figured out how to get in through a window well or something. They were smart, right? Could probably push doors open, make weird noises, leave smells behind. I grabbed a broom from the closet, held it like a baseball bat, and called down into the basement in my deepest voice, trying to sound way bigger and older than a skinny teenager who weighed maybe 140 pounds soaking wet. Nothing responded, but I heard movement, a shuffling sound like something dragging across the floor near the back wall where Dad kept his tools. I backed away from the door, pulled out my phone, and searched for animal control numbers while keeping my eyes on that dark opening, terrified something would come charging up those stairs. The animal control guy showed up 45 minutes later, this older man named Frank, who looked like he'd been doing this job since before I was born, complete with thick canvas gloves and a pole with a loop on the end. He asked me a bunch of questions about what I'd heard and smelled, nodding like he'd dealt with this exact situation 100 times before. He grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from his truck, one of those metal ones that could probably double as a weapon, and told me to wait upstairs while he checked things out. I stood in the kitchen, practically pressed against the counter, listening to his heavy boots descending the stairs, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness below. For maybe 2 minutes, I heard him moving around down there, boxes sliding, his occasional grunt as he bent to look under something. Then I heard him say something that made my entire body go rigid. Not a shout exactly, but this sharp, commanding voice. "Sir, I need you to stand up slowly and keep your hands where I can see them." My brain couldn't process what I was hearing because he'd said sir, not addressing some animal but talking to a person, a human being who had been in my basement. Frank's voice got louder, more urgent. I said, "Stand up now. I've already called the police and they're on their way." I heard scrambling, something crashing to the floor, and Frank came backing up the stairs fast, his hand on what I now realized was a can of pepper spray on his belt. Behind him, slowly, came another set of footsteps, and then I saw him, this man, probably in his 40s, wearing layers of dirty clothes, a beanie pulled low over greasy hair, his eyes darting between Frank and me like a trapped animal calculating escape routes. The man didn't run though, just stood there at the top of the stairs with his shoulders hunched forward, breathing heavy through his mouth, this raspy sound that made my skin prickle. Frank positioned himself between us, telling me to go wait outside, but I couldn't move, couldn't stop staring at this stranger who'd been in my house, under my feet, while I'd been alone upstairs doing homework or playing video games. The man kept muttering something I couldn't quite make out, his voice rough like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days, maybe weeks. His fingernails were black with dirt, and I noticed he had a plastic grocery bag tied to his belt, bulging with what looked like food wrappers and empty cans. When he finally looked directly at me, his eyes were this pale blue color, almost gray, and completely empty of any emotion I could recognize, like looking at a mannequin that could blink. The police arrived within minutes, 2 officers who immediately took control of the situation, one talking to the man in calm, measured tones, while the other asked Frank and me to step outside. Standing on my own front lawn, watching more police cars pull up, I started shaking so hard I had to sit down on the grass. The officer, a woman with short red hair who introduced herself as Officer Brennan, knelt beside me and explained that they'd need to search the entire house, especially the basement, to understand what had been happening. She asked if my parents were coming home, and I managed to call my mom, barely getting the words out that someone had been in our house. I could hear her panic through the phone, saying she'd leave work immediately, asking if I was hurt, if I was safe. All I could tell her was that I was okay, even though I didn't feel okay at all, watching strangers in uniform going in and out of my house like it was a crime scene. My parents arrived at the same time, Mom practically jumping out of the car before Dad had fully stopped, running across the lawn to grab me in this crushing hug that made me realize how badly I needed it. The police had the man in handcuffs by then, sitting in the back of a patrol car, and Officer Brennan walked us through what they'd discovered. Behind our house, hidden by the overgrown juniper bushes Dad had been meaning to trim since summer, was a loose ventilation grate that led directly into the basement. The screws had been carefully removed and placed in a neat pile nearby, allowing someone to slide the grate aside and crawl through. Inside the basement, they found evidence he'd been coming and going for at least 2 weeks, maybe longer. He'd made himself a sleeping area behind the water heater, using an old sleeping bag he must have brought with him, had a collection of our canned goods stacked against the wall, and had even run an extension cord from our outlet to charge a cheap prepaid phone. The worst part was finding my school schedule printed out, probably from the school website, with the times I got home circled in pencil. They arrested him for breaking and entering, trespassing, and theft, though Officer Brennan said he'd likely been homeless and looking for somewhere warm to sleep as the weather turned cold. That didn't make me feel any better about it, knowing he'd deliberately waited until I was alone, that he'd been down there listening to me walking around above him, maybe even coming upstairs when I had headphones on or was in the shower. Dad had a security company come out that same night to install cameras and new locks, sealed up every possible entry point with metal grating and industrial screws, but none of that helped me sleep. For months afterward, I couldn't be alone in the house without checking every door, every window, looking behind furniture and in closets like a paranoid person. Even now, living in my own apartment near campus, I still get this sick feeling when I hear unexpected noises from other units, and I've never once gone into the basement of any building without someone else with me, no matter how well lit or safe it seems. Every November when the leaves start falling and people drag out their rakes, I get this sick feeling in my gut that won't go away. 4 years have passed since that Saturday afternoon when everything changed, but I can still smell the wet leaves mixed with gasoline whenever autumn rolls around. I'd just moved to this neighborhood in Michigan about 6 months before, landed a job at a marketing firm downtown, and was finally feeling like I belonged somewhere after bouncing between apartments since college. My neighbor Jason had invited me to what he called their annual leaf-burning party, which was basically an excuse for everyone on our block to drink beer and pretend they were actually cleaning up their yards. Jason lived 3 houses down from me in one of those split-level homes with the huge backyard that backed up to a small wooded area. His wife Amanda had strung up these orange lights between the trees, and someone had brought over a couple of folding tables loaded with chili, cornbread, and those pumpkin-shaped sugar cookies from the grocery store. There were maybe 15 of us there, mostly couples in their 30s and 40s, plus a few single people like me who'd gotten absorbed into the neighborhood social circle. Everyone was bundled up in flannel shirts and puffy vests, standing around in small groups while kids ran through the leaf piles screaming and throwing handfuls at each other. Fire pit was this circular metal thing Jason had bought at Home Depot, about 3 feet across, and sitting on a patch of gravel he'd laid out specifically for it. We'd been trying to get a decent fire going for about 20 minutes, but everything was working against us. It had rained hard for 3 days straight earlier that week, and even though Jason had covered his wood pile with a blue tarp, moisture had gotten into everything. The logs would smoke and hiss but wouldn't catch properly, just producing these pathetic little flames that kept dying out. People were starting to make jokes about calling it quits and just using the propane heater on the deck, but Jason was determined to get that fire roaring. I was standing by the cooler grabbing another beer when I heard Brandon, this guy who lived at the end of the street, say he had a gas can in his truck from filling up his lawnmower that morning. Brandon was one of those guys who always had to be the problem solver, the one with all the answers and the right tools for every situation. He jogged over to his F-150 parked on the street and came back with a red plastic gas can, the kind with the long yellow spout. Most of us were too busy talking or watching our kids to really pay attention to what was happening next, which is something I think about constantly now. how differently things might have gone if just one person had said something. Megan was standing right there next to the fire pit, holding her daughter Sophia, who'd just turned 3, and was wearing this tiny pink winter coat with fur around the hood. Megan had graduated from Michigan State the same year I finished at Western, though we didn't know that until later, and she'd been nothing but welcoming since I moved in. She was showing Sophia how the smoke was rising up into the sky, pointing at it with one hand while balancing the kid on her hip. The wind had been pretty calm all afternoon, just a gentle breeze that would occasionally stir the leaves around our feet. But right as Brandon started pouring that gasoline, a gust came out of nowhere from the north. What people don't understand about gasoline is that it's not the liquid that's dangerous, it's the vapor. On a cold day like that, maybe 40 degrees, the fumes don't dissipate as quickly as you'd think. They hang in the air, invisible, building up in pockets, especially when there's no wind to carry them away. Brandon poured what he later said was just a splash, but I watched that stream of gas flow for at least 3 or 4 seconds, soaking into the damp wood and pooling at the bottom of the fire pit. He tossed the can aside and pulled out his lighter, one of those long barbecue lighters with the trigger, and that's when everything went wrong in a way that still plays behind my eyelids when I try to sleep. The wind shifted right as Brandon clicked the lighter, and instead of the fire starting in the pit where he was aiming, the flame hit that invisible cloud of vapor that had drifted toward Megan. It wasn't like a movie explosion with people flying backwards. It was more like the air itself became orange and hot for half a second. This whooshing sound that I can only compare to when you open a preheated oven and that blast of heat hits your face, except multiplied by 100. Megan screamed, a sound I'd never heard a human make before, raw and primal, and she instinctively turned her body to shield Sophia, which meant her back and the side of her neck took the worst of it. The smell hit me immediately, not like barbecue or campfire, but something chemical and wrong, mixed with burning polyester from her jacket. Everyone moved at once then, Jason running for the garden hose, Amanda screaming for someone to call 911, Brandon standing there with the lighter still in his hand, looking like his brain couldn't process what had just happened. I dropped my beer and ran to Megan, who had managed to set Sophia down safely, but was now on her knees in the grass, reaching behind herself trying to get her jacket off. Her husband Nathan came out of nowhere, must have been inside using the bathroom, and when he saw her he made this choking sound that turned into him yelling her name over and over. I helped him get the jacket off her while trying not to look at what was underneath, but you can't unsee something like that, the way skin bubbles and turns white in some places, angry red in others. The ambulance took 11 minutes to arrive, though it felt like hours. Amanda had grabbed Sophia and taken her inside along with the other kids, trying to distract them with cartoons while the adults dealt with the chaos outside. Someone had found a clean sheet from Jason's linen closet, and we carefully draped it over Megan's burns while she sat on the ground, rocking slightly and making these small, whimpering sounds. Nathan held her hand and kept telling her she was going to be okay, but his face was white as paper, and his voice cracked every time he spoke. The EMTs were efficient and professional, getting an IV started right there on the lawn, giving her something for the pain that made her eyes go unfocused and drowsy. After they loaded Megan into the ambulance with Nathan climbing in beside her, the rest of us just stood there in Jason's backyard like we'd forgotten how to move. The fire pit was still smoldering, producing this thin black smoke that made my eyes water. Or maybe that was something else entirely. Brandon hadn't said a word since it happened, just stood by his truck staring at the ground, and when the police showed up to take statements, he could barely get the words out. They determined it was an accident, no charges filed, just a catastrophically stupid decision that couldn't be undone. The officer taking my statement said these kinds of things happened more often than people realized, especially in the fall, when everyone was burning leaves and trying to get fires started with wet wood. Megan spent 3 weeks in the burn unit at University Hospital, underwent 4 different skin graft surgeries over the next 8 months, and still has to wear compression garments on her neck and shoulder. The scars are there, will always be there, this twisted map of that November afternoon permanently etched on her skin. She and Nathan moved away the following summer, said they found a better school district for Sophia, but we all knew the real reason. Every time they looked at that backyard 3 houses down, every time they saw Brandon's truck parked on the street, they were right back in that moment. Brandon lasted another year before he sold his house too. Told me at the closing that he hadn't slept a full night since the accident, that he'd started seeing a therapist but couldn't shake the guilt of what his impatience had caused. I still live on that street, still see Jason and Amanda at the grocery store, still wave when I pass their house on my morning runs. They never had another fall gathering after that day. Nobody in the neighborhood did. We rake our leaves into bags now, haul them to the curb for the city to collect, and nobody mentions the obvious absence of autumn bonfires. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I run through all the moments where someone could have stopped it, where I could have stopped it. If I'd just looked up from that cooler 5 seconds earlier, if I'd seen Brandon with that gas can and said something, anything. But I didn't. None of us did. And now Megan lives with the consequences of our collective inaction every single day of her life. Quitting my job at the insurance company felt like finally taking off shoes that were 2 sizes too small. I'd spent the better part of my 20s working toward what I thought I was supposed to want, and by September, I just couldn't do it anymore. My parents were horrified when I turned in my resignation without another position lined up. But I had savings, I had time, and honestly, I needed to figure out who I actually was outside of spreadsheets and client calls. The plan wasn't complicated. Spend the fall hiking every trail I could find within driving distance of my Vermont apartment, clear my head, maybe stumble into some kind of clarity about what came next. That late afternoon in the final week of the month, I chose Miller's Pass specifically because almost nobody hikes it. The trail doesn't show up on those popular hiking apps, just a straightforward 4-mile loop through dense woods with one rocky overlook roughly halfway through. When I pulled into the gravel lot around 3, only 2 other cars sat there, and I felt this wave of relief wash over me. Solitude was exactly what I needed. The beginning of the trail delivered everything I'd hoped for. Overhead, the canopy had already shed most of its leaves, creating these skeletal archways where afternoon light slanted through in sharp golden beams. The air tasted like wet earth and rotting foliage, that distinctly autumn mixture of growth and decomposition happening simultaneously. About 20 minutes in, I passed an older man heading back down, expensive hiking poles clicking against rocks, who gave me a brief nod but kept moving. Perfect. I didn't want conversation. The incline increased steadily as I climbed higher, and the leaf coverage got thicker, everything slick and compressed from overnight rain. My boots had good tread, but I could feel them wanting to slide on certain patches. The overlook appeared right when my legs were starting to burn, and the view made the climb worth every step. Hills stretched endlessly in every direction, covered in bare branches with fog pooling in the low spots like spilled milk. I snapped a few photos, ate a granola bar, pulled out my phone to check the time. No signal, which I'd expected. Nearly 4 already, and the quality of light was shifting into that deep amber that signals maybe an hour left before real darkness starts creeping in. The descent from the overlook should have been straightforward. I'd noticed on my way up that the trail curved sharply to the left about 15 feet past the viewpoint, following the natural contour of the ridge. But standing there at the edge, looking down at the valley, I spotted what looked like a shortcut. Just a gentle slope covered in leaves that seemed to angle back toward where the main trail would be, maybe saving me a few minutes of switchbacks. Stupid decision, I know that now. But in the moment, it seemed harmless enough. The slope didn't look that steep, and I'd been hiking for months without incident. I took one step onto the leaf-covered ground, then another. The third step, my boot hit something slick underneath all that organic debris, maybe a wet rock or a rotted log, and suddenly my feet went out from under me completely. I didn't even have time to yell. My hip slammed into the ground first, then I was sliding, rolling, grabbing at nothing but handfuls of wet leaves and loose dirt. Branches whipped past my face, rocks jabbed into my ribs, and the whole world became this chaotic tumble of brown and gray and pain. When I finally stopped moving, I was on my back, staring up at the darkening sky through a gap in the trees. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, and every part of my body was screaming. I stayed there for probably 30 seconds, just doing a mental inventory. Fingers moved, toes moved, nothing felt broken exactly, just battered to hell. My left knee throbbed where it had connected with something hard on the way down, and I could feel wetness on my forehead that was probably blood from a scrape. Slowly, carefully, I rolled onto my side and looked around. I'd fallen maybe 20 or 25 feet down into what was basically a ravine, steep walls on 3 sides covered in that same deceptive carpet of leaves. Above me, I could barely make out the edge of the overlook through the bare branches. The main trail was somewhere off to my left, I thought, but down here everything looked different, disorienting. The light was dimmer too, filtered through layers of tree trunks, and I realized with a spike of genuine fear that I needed to get back up to the trail before it got dark. I got to my feet, testing my weight on each leg. The knee hurt like hell but held. My backpack had stayed on somehow, though it felt heavier now, probably from all the dirt and debris that had gotten inside during the fall. I turned toward what I thought was the best route back up, a slightly less vertical section of the slope, and that's when I saw it. A phone, or what was left of one. The screen was completely shattered, spider-webbed into 1,000 pieces, and the case was dark blue with some kind of sparkly design. It was just lying there in the leaves about 6 feet from where I'd landed, face up, like someone had dropped it. My first thought was that maybe I'd knocked it loose during my fall, that it had been buried in the leaves, and I just happened to uncover it. But I checked my pockets and my phone was still there, intact. This was someone else's phone. I picked it up, turned it over. The back was scratched to hell, and when I tried the power button, nothing happened. Dead, or broken, or both. A cold feeling started spreading through my chest, something beyond the pain from my fall. I looked around more carefully now, really scanning the ground instead of just trying to orient myself. That's when I noticed the jacket. It was wedged partially under a fallen branch about 10 feet further down the slope, torn badly along one sleeve. Navy blue, or maybe black, hard to tell in the fading light. The fabric was still damp, not from last night's rain, but from something more recent. I moved closer, my injured knee protesting with each step, and crouched down to get a better look. The tear wasn't just a rip from catching on a branch. The edges were shredded, like the person wearing it had been dragged through something rough, or had desperately grabbed at the ground while sliding. And there, pressed into the wet leaves all around the jacket, were marks. Long, uneven gouges in the earth, the kind that fingernails make when someone's trying to stop themselves from falling. My heart started hammering against my ribs. Someone else had fallen here, recently enough that their stuff was still here, and from the looks of it, they'd been terrified while it happened. I stood up too fast and pain shot through my knee, but I barely registered it. My brain was trying to piece together what I was seeing, trying to make it make sense. Maybe someone had fallen like I did, gotten hurt, and hiked out for help. Maybe they'd come back with rangers to retrieve their stuff and just hadn't made it yet. That had to be it. Except, as I turned to start climbing back up toward the trail, I saw the drag marks. Not the desperate scratches from fingernails, but actual drag marks. 2 parallel lines pressed deep into the soft ground, starting right where the jacket lay and continuing down the slope, disappearing into thicker brush further into the ravine. The lines were maybe 1.5 feet apart, consistent, purposeful, like something heavy had been pulled downhill, like a body. My mouth went completely dry. I followed the marks with my eyes as far as I could see them, maybe another 30 feet before they vanished into a dense tangle of undergrowth and fallen trees. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to climb back up to the trail right now, to get out of this ravine and back to my car, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at those lines, understanding with absolute certainty that whoever had lost that phone and that jacket hadn't walked away from this spot. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant, or maybe that was just adrenaline making me shake. I forced myself to turn away from the drag marks and look back up at the slope I needed to climb. It was steep, covered in those same treacherous wet leaves, and now I understood why there was so much debris down here, why the phone and jacket had ended up in almost the exact spot where I'd landed. This wasn't just a random steep section. This was a place where people fell, where the ground gave way and sent you tumbling whether you wanted to or not. And someone knew that. Someone had been here, had stood at that overlook or somewhere near it, and had watched someone fall. Had maybe even made sure they fell. Then they'd climbed down, found whoever it was, and dragged them deeper into the woods. The evidence was right there in front of me, undeniable and horrifying. I needed to get out of here, needed to get to somewhere with cell service and call the police. But first, I had to climb back up this slope without falling again, and the light was fading fast now, turning everything into shades of gray and shadow. I grabbed onto the nearest tree trunk, testing its stability before putting my full weight on it. My knee screamed in protest, but I ignored it, focusing entirely on finding the next handhold, the next solid foothold beneath the leaves. Every few feet I'd stop and listen, straining to hear anything beyond my own ragged breathing and the rustling of branches in the wind. Part of me kept expecting to hear footsteps above me on the trail, to see a silhouette appear at the top of the slope looking down. The climb took forever. My fingers were numb from gripping rough bark and cold stone, and twice I slipped backward a few feet before catching myself. When I finally hauled myself over the edge back onto the main trail, I collapsed onto my hands and knees, gasping. The overlook was maybe 20 feet to my right, exactly where I'd been standing before I fell. How long had I been down there? 20 minutes, 30? The sky had gone from amber to deep purple, and the first stars were starting to show through gaps in the canopy. I forced myself to stand, every muscle in my body protesting. The parking lot was still over 2 miles away, most of it downhill, but some sections steep enough that I'd need to be careful in the growing darkness. I started moving as fast as my injured knee would allow, half walking, half limping down the trail. The forest around me had transformed into something alien and menacing, every shadow potentially hiding someone, every snapping twig making me jerk my head around. I kept thinking about those drag marks, about how deliberate they'd looked, how recent that jacket had seemed. What if whoever did it was still out here? What if they'd seen my car in the parking lot and were waiting? The thoughts spiraled in my head, feeding my panic, but I couldn't stop them. When I finally saw the trail marker indicating half a mile to the parking area, I nearly sobbed with relief. The light was almost completely gone now, just the barest glow from the western horizon filtering through the trees. I pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight even though it would drain my battery, and picked up my pace despite the pain shooting through my knee with every step. The parking lot appeared through the trees like a miracle, the gravel pale and visible even in the near darkness. My car sat exactly where I'd left it, and the 2 other vehicles that had been there earlier were gone. I was completely alone. I fumbled with my keys, dropped them once, finally got the door unlocked and threw myself into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. The engine turned over, and I just sat there for a moment, door locked, breathing hard, staring out at the trailhead. Nobody emerged from the path, no movement in the shadows. I pulled out my phone again, praying for signal, and watched as 1 bar flickered into existence. Enough. I dialed 911, and when the dispatcher answered, everything came pouring out in a rush. The fall, the phone, the jacket, the drag marks leading deeper into the ravine. She kept me on the line, asking questions about my exact location, whether I was injured, whether I'd seen anyone else on the trail. I told her about the older man I'd passed on my way up, how the parking lot had been nearly empty, how isolated the whole area was. She told me to drive to the ranger station about 15 minutes down the mountain road and wait there, that they were sending someone to meet me. The ranger station was lit up when I arrived, and 2 Vermont State Police cruisers were already there. I spent the next 4 hours telling my story over and over, first to the rangers, then to the state police, then to a detective who showed up around 8. They took photos of my injuries, my muddy clothes, the scrapes on my hands. Around midnight, they told me search and rescue teams were heading up to Miller's Pass at first light, that they'd already contacted the phone company to try identifying the owner of the device I'd described. A female officer drove me home because they didn't want me driving with my knee in that condition. She was kind, told me I'd done the right thing reporting it immediately. 2 days later, a detective called my apartment. They'd found remains in the ravine, exactly where the drag marks had led. A hiker named Vincent Riley reported missing 3 weeks earlier after telling his roommate he was going to Miller's Pass. But that wasn't all they found. Once they started looking carefully at that section of trail, they discovered evidence of at least 2 other incidents in the past 6 months. Disturbed earth near the overlook, more personal items deeper in the woods. Within a week, they'd arrested a local man named Gregory Walsh who did trail maintenance for the Forestry Service. He'd been using his knowledge of the area's most isolated paths, watching for solo hikers on quiet weekdays when nobody else was around, then following them to the overlook and pushing them when the moment was right. The autumn leaf cover and early sunset gave him perfect conditions. They said if I hadn't fallen and found that evidence, if I hadn't reported it immediately, he probably would have kept going indefinitely. I haven't been back to Miller's Pass, and honestly I don't know if I ever will. My knee healed after about 6 weeks of physical therapy, but the mental part took longer. For months afterward, I couldn't hike alone without constantly looking behind me, couldn't enjoy the solitude I'd been craving when I quit my job. The trial happened last spring, and I had to testify about what I'd found in that ravine. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to the prosecutor lay out the timeline of Walsh's crimes, hearing the families of the other victims, it hit me how close I'd come to being one of them. If I'd arrived an hour earlier when he was still on the trail, if I'd been slower and encountered him on my way back down in the darkness, if he'd seen me climb out of that ravine. The detective told me later that Walsh had actually walked past my car in the parking lot that afternoon, that they'd found his truck parked on a service road a quarter mile away. He'd been there. I still hike, because I refuse to let him take that away from me, but I'm careful now in ways I never was before. I check trail reports, I tell people exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back. And I never ever go out alone on empty weekdays in the late afternoon. Some fears are worth keeping. The drive between Harrisburg and Carlisle takes about 40 minutes if you stick to Route 74, cutting through farmland and patches of forest that turn absolutely gorgeous when the leaves change. I'd been making that commute twice a day for 6 months, ever since landing the accounting job downtown. Most people from my 2012 graduating class had already moved closer to their workplaces, but I actually enjoyed the separation between office life and home, even when it meant spending over an hour in the car daily. By mid-fall, though, the beauty had mostly faded. The trees stood bare and gray against the sky, and daylight disappeared earlier each week. Leaving the office at 6:30 meant driving home in total darkness, just my headlights cutting through the night, and maybe 1 or 2 other cars passing by every few miles. That Wednesday felt particularly draining. I'd spent 9 straight hours hunched over spreadsheets, working on a complicated estate case my boss had dropped on my desk that morning. 5 years of financial records to sort through, and my eyes felt like sandpaper by the time I finally shut down my computer. All I could think about was getting home, microwaving some leftovers and melting into my couch. The temperature had plummeted that week, one of those sudden cold snaps where you wake up and suddenly realize winter is right around the corner. I stopped at the gas station just outside Harrisburg to fill up and grab coffee, and Bill, the older guy who worked evenings there, warned me to watch for deer on the back roads. "They're real active this time of year," he said, handing me my change. I thanked him, clutched my coffee like a lifeline, and headed back out into the frigid darkness, completely clueless about what was actually waiting for me out there. Route 74 gets pretty desolate once you leave the Harrisburg suburbs behind. During the day, you'll see farmers working their fields, maybe some kids waiting at bus stops, the occasional roadside produce stand. At night, especially in late fall, it becomes a different place entirely. Just empty asphalt stretching ahead, broken up by the rare porch light from a farmhouse set way back from the road. The forest presses in close on both sides in certain stretches, and your high beams only reach so far before everything dissolves into blackness. I'd gotten used to it over the months, even found it peaceful in a way. That night, about 20 minutes into my drive, I was sipping my coffee and half listening to some podcast about true crime, ironically enough, when my headlights caught something up ahead on the right shoulder. A pickup truck sat partially off the road, hazard lights blinking orange in the darkness. The hood was propped open, and a figure stood beside it, illuminated in that weird flickering glow. As I got closer, I could make out more details. Older model Dodge Ram, dark green or maybe brown, hard to tell in the poor light. The person was wearing a thick winter coat and a baseball cap, waving one arm slowly back and forth like they were trying to flag someone down. My first instinct was to keep driving. I'd heard plenty of stories about scams and dangerous situations, and a lone person on a deserted road at night definitely triggered some alarm bells. But then I thought about how cold it was, how infrequently cars pass through this stretch, and how terrified I'd be if I were the one stranded out here. The internal debate probably lasted 3 seconds, but it felt longer. Finally, against every true crime podcast I'd ever listened to, I eased off the gas and started slowing down. I pulled up about 15 feet behind the truck and put my car in park, leaving the engine running. Through my windshield, I could see the person more clearly now. Average height, stocky build, the baseball cap pulled low. They turned toward my car and I rolled down my window maybe 4 inches, just enough to talk through. "Hey, you need help?" I called out. The person walked toward my car, moving with this odd measured pace that made my chest tighten a little. When they got close enough, I noticed their face was partially obscured by a thick scarf wrapped around the lower half, which made sense given the temperature, but also made it impossible to read their expression. "Yeah, truck just died on me," they said, voice muffled through the scarf. "Battery's dead, I think. You got jumper cables?" I didn't, actually. I'd been meaning to buy a set for months but kept forgetting. "Sorry, no," I said, and I was about to suggest calling a tow truck when they took another step closer to my door. That's when every nerve in my body suddenly started screaming at me. The person's hand moved to their coat pocket, and in one fluid motion, they pulled out a handgun. Not some little pistol either, but a full-sized revolver that looked massive in the glow of my headlights. "Turn off the car and get out," they said, voice completely flat now, no panic or hesitation. My brain couldn't process what was happening. This felt like a scene from a movie, not something that could actually be happening to me on my regular Wednesday commute home. "Get out of the car now," they repeated, louder this time, and raised the gun so it was pointing directly at my face through the window gap. My whole body went into this weird autopilot mode. I didn't think, didn't plan, just acted on pure survival instinct. Instead of turning off the engine, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The Corolla lurched forward, tires squealing, and I heard a loud bang that might have been a gunshot or might have been my door slamming against something. I didn't look back to find out. My only thought was, get away, get away, get away. But I'd only made it maybe 30 yards when I realized the horrible truth. The road ahead curved sharply to the left, and in my panic, I'd accelerated way too fast. I hit the brakes hard, but the Corolla skidded on some wet leaves scattered across the asphalt. The car went sideways, and then I felt the sickening crunch of the front passenger side slamming into a drainage ditch. The impact wasn't severe enough to deploy the airbags, but it was definitely severe enough to stop me dead. The engine sputtered and died. I tried restarting it, turning the key again and again while my heart hammered against my ribs, but all I got was a grinding noise, and then nothing. Through my rearview mirror, I could see a flashlight beam bobbing in the darkness, getting closer. They were coming after me on foot. I had maybe 30 seconds, maybe less. I grabbed my phone from the cup holder, shoved it in my jacket pocket, and threw open the driver's side door. The cold air hit me like a physical blow, but I didn't hesitate. I ran straight into the woods on the left side of the road, branches whipping at my face and arms as I crashed through the underbrush. The forest was pitch black away from the road, and I had no idea where I was going. I just pushed forward, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and that person with the gun. Low branches caught my hair and scratched my cheeks. I tripped over a fallen log and went down hard on my knees, the impact sending a sharp pain shooting up my legs. Behind me, I could hear thrashing sounds. The snap of breaking twigs. They'd followed me into the woods. I scrambled back to my feet and kept moving, one hand stretched out in front of me to avoid running face first into a tree trunk. My breath came in ragged gasps that sounded way too loud in the quiet forest. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes, I spotted a massive oak tree with a hollowed-out section at its base, probably from rot or lightning damage years ago. Without thinking twice, I wedged myself inside, pressing my back against the rough wood and pulling my knees up to my chest to make myself as small as possible. Then I forced myself to stop moving, stop breathing so hard, and just listen. The woods went silent for a moment, just the sound of wind moving through the bare branches above. Then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the dry leaves maybe 40 or 50 feet away. The flashlight beam swept back and forth, creating crazy dancing shadows between the trees. "I know you're out here," the person called out, voice echoing slightly in the empty forest. "Might as well come out. You can't hide forever, and that's a long walk back to civilization." They were trying to flush me out, I realized, trying to make me panic and run again so they could track the noise. I bit down on my sleeve to keep from making any sound, and stayed absolutely still inside that hollow tree, even though every muscle in my body was screaming at me to bolt. The beam passed within 10 feet of my hiding spot, close enough that I could see the individual particles of bark on the trees around me. I closed my eyes, some childish part of my brain thinking that if I couldn't see them, they couldn't see me. The footsteps paused. My lungs burned from holding my breath. Then, after what felt like a decade, the footsteps started moving again, heading away from me, deeper into the woods in the wrong direction. I waited until I couldn't hear anything anymore before I dared to move. Even then, I counted to 300 in my head, forcing myself to stay hidden just in case it was a trick. When I finally crawled out of the hollow, my legs had gone numb from being cramped in that position, and I nearly fell again. I pulled out my phone, and thankfully it still had battery and a weak signal, just 1 bar. My fingers shook so badly I could barely unlock the screen, but I managed to dial 911. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, and I whispered my situation as quietly as I could while still being understood. She stayed on the line with me, her calm voice the only thing keeping me from completely losing it, and told me to head back toward the road but stay hidden in the tree line. State police were already on their way. It took me almost 20 minutes to work my way back, moving slowly and carefully, stopping every few feet to listen. When I finally saw the flashing red and blue lights through the trees, I actually started crying from relief. 3 state police cruisers had blocked off the road, and an ambulance sat parked nearby with its lights running. The officers found me stumbling out of the woods, covered in scratches and dirt, probably looking half dead. They wrapped me in one of those foil emergency blankets and sat me in the back of an ambulance while a paramedic checked me over. I told them everything, talking so fast the words tumbled over each other. The truck, the gun, the crash, running through the woods. While I was giving my statement to one officer, I watched another team examining my Corolla, still nose down in that ditch. A third officer walked up holding an evidence bag, and inside it I could see my driver's side mirror, completely sheared off. "Found this about 10 feet from your vehicle," he said. "Looks like maybe a bullet clipped it when you took off." That made everything feel horribly real all over again. The person had actually fired at me. If I'd hesitated even 1 second longer, if I'd been sitting differently in my seat, that bullet could have gone through the window instead of hitting the mirror. The officer told me I'd done exactly the right thing by running and hiding, that trying to comply or reason with someone like that in such an isolated area rarely ends well. The attacker had vanished, but they'd left the truck behind in their escape. Over the next week, I learned the full scope of what had been happening. That green Dodge Ram had been reported by multiple people over the past month, always in the same general area, along Route 74 and the connecting back roads. Hunters heading out to their stands before dawn had seen it parked in different spots, always with the hood up, always looking disabled. One guy had even stopped to help 2 weeks earlier but said the driver waved him off, claiming a friend was already on the way. Authorities figured the person had been staging these fake breakdowns specifically during fall, when the combination of fewer cars, early darkness, and hunting season meant plenty of vehicles traveling alone on rural roads. They were targeting solo drivers during that narrow window of time, when someone would be both vulnerable and potentially carrying hunting equipment or money. Police found camping gear in the truck bed, suggesting they'd been staying somewhere nearby between attempts. They ran the plates and discovered the truck had been reported stolen from a parking lot in Hershey 3 months prior. DNA evidence and fingerprints eventually led them to someone with a history of armed robbery in 2 other states, and they arrested him at a motel outside of Chambersburg 6 days after my encounter. I had to identify him in a lineup, and seeing that face again, even through protective glass with officers all around me, made my chest tighten with the same terror I'd felt that night. He's serving 15 years now, though that hardly feels like enough given what he'd been doing, and what he'd planned to do to however many other people he could ambush out there. I take Interstate 81 to work now, even though it adds 20 minutes to my commute. I don't care. Some roads aren't worth the shortcut, and I'll never look at a stranded vehicle the same way again. The colder nights always seem to sneak up on us around the start of November, and that particular year wasn't any different. My life back then was pretty steady. Long shifts at the auto shop, kids busy with school projects, and my wife juggling her work-from-home schedule. Our house sat on a quiet street lined with maples that turned this deep copper color, the kind that looked almost wet after sunset. We weren't prepared for the sudden temperature drop, so we dug through the garage looking for that old space heater we hadn't touched in a long time. I remember brushing off a layer of dust that had settled unevenly across its metal grate, like a film of ash. It felt harmless, just a temporary fix until we bought something newer. Nothing about that moment hinted that the rest of the night would carve itself into my memory. The day had been ordinary enough that I didn't pay attention to the little things, like how the garage smelled faintly of dried leaves and something stale, or how a few cardboard boxes had sagged from moisture during the summer. We set the heater in the corner of the living room, near an outlet that had always been slightly crooked, tilted just a bit downward as if the wall had shifted over time. I remember feeling relieved when that heater hummed to life, the coils glowing this dull orange, giving off that faint metallic scent. The kids sat near it with blankets around their shoulders, laughing at some cartoon, and for a while the warmth felt comforting in a way that made the house seem smaller, cozier. I didn't know that behind that crooked outlet, wires were pressed against wooden beams that had dried out from months of heat. By midnight, the house had settled into that deep stillness that only happens on cold nights. No air conditioning running, no fans buzzing, just the quiet rhythm of everyone sleeping. My dog Riley kept shifting at the foot of the bed, letting out soft huffs like he could sense something I couldn't. I remember waking up briefly because the air felt heavier than usual, almost like the room wasn't cycling it properly. I chalked it up to the heater running for hours, though it wasn't even in our bedroom. Outside, a breeze moved the last brittle leaves around the porch, making this faint tapping sound against the siding. I rolled over and went back to sleep without a second thought, unaware that inside the walls, slow-burning embers were crawling upward like they had a destination. It must have been some time before dawn when a faint, distant beep threaded into a dream I was having. At first, I didn't understand what I was waking up to. The sound was muted, almost lazy, as if the alarm itself was struggling. When I sat up, my vision was foggy, and there was this smell, sharp, dry, almost like singed paper, floating barely above the air. Riley stood rigid beside the bed, ears pointed toward the hallway. The beeping grew steadier, and I remember stepping into the hallway expecting maybe a burnt outlet or the heater malfunctioning. Instead, I saw a thin haze drifting near the ceiling, moving as if the whole house was breathing in slow, shallow pulses. I didn't panic yet, but something inside me tightened, the way it does when you're trying to make sense of something that doesn't line up. The further I walked down the hallway, the more the air felt strange, dry, almost gritty, like dust stirred up after moving old furniture. When I reached the living room, the haze had thickened into a pale sheet drifting from the far corner, right above the outlet we'd used for the heater. The heater itself was off, but the wall around it looked darker, almost bruised, like the paint had been warmed too long. A faint crackling sound tapped behind the drywall, subtle enough that you'd miss it if the house wasn't so quiet. I remember touching the wall and pulling my hand back because the surface felt warmer than it had any right to be. It hit me then that whatever was happening wasn't just a burnt plug. Something deeper was going wrong. I yelled for everyone to get up, and the kids rushed out of their rooms half asleep, clutching blankets over their shoulders. My wife grabbed her phone and the dog's leash while I tried to keep my breathing steady. The smoke alarm in the kitchen started blaring next, its tone sharper, more frantic than the first one. By the time we made it to the front door, the haze behind us had turned into a rolling cloud that smeared the hallway windows with a pale gray film. Outside, the air felt startlingly cold compared to the heat gathering inside, and our breaths puffed out like steam. The sky was still dark, but there was a faint line of silver light in the distance hinting at morning. I remember feeling torn between relief that we made it out and dread that the house wasn't done with whatever was happening. What I didn't expect was how quickly things escalated. From the front yard, the house looked perfectly normal. No flames, no dramatic glow. Just a quiet suburban home in the early morning stillness. But within minutes, the windows facing the living room fogged over from the inside, each one turning opaque like frosted glass. A low thump echoed from within the walls, followed by a subtle shudder that ran along the siding. One of the neighbors walked out in a robe, rubbing his arms against the cold, asking if everything was all right. I could barely answer because I was watching a dull orange bloom behind the living room curtains, spreading upward like it was climbing toward the ceiling. It was surreal, seeing the fire announce itself only after it had already grown strong enough to choke the inside. When the fire trucks arrived, the firefighters moved with a kind of practiced urgency, pulling hoses and axes while the rest of the neighborhood gathered on driveways. One of them ran a gloved hand along the siding near the outlet wall and muttered something to his partner that I couldn't catch, but the expression on his face told me it wasn't good. As they breached the front door, a wave of dark smoke spilled out so thick it looked almost like fabric being pulled apart. I kept staring at the house, noticing tiny details I'd never paid attention to before. The crooked mailbox, the chipped paint on the railing, the way the porch light flickered even though it wasn't supposed to be on. All of it suddenly felt fragile, like the life we'd built there had been balancing on a thin edge without us realizing. And for the first time that morning, the reality of losing the place began to sink in. Even hours later, once the flames were finally out, the house looked like a hollowed-out shell. The roof sagged slightly on one side, and the front windows had melted into warped shapes that barely resembled glass. A fire investigator walked the perimeter with a flashlight even though the sun was already up, angling the beam into gaps in the siding like he was searching for something hiding in there. When he approached me, he spoke gently, asking about the heater, the outlet, the last time anything electrical had given us trouble. I told him about a faint buzzing sound we'd heard during the summer near that same wall, something we brushed off as pests moving around. He nodded in a way that made me feel like that tiny detail mattered more than I realized. Later that afternoon, he brought me behind the house to show where the fire had likely started. The wooden beams inside the wall were scorched in a way that created this uneven pattern, almost like a trail snaking upward. He explained that the wiring had probably dried out during the heat waves earlier in the year, leaving the insulation brittle. On top of that, rodents looking for warmth had nested in the walls, chewing through parts of the wiring. When we plugged the heater into that outlet, it stressed the damaged wires just enough to spark a slow-burning fire. The worst part was when he mentioned that an inspection years ago should have caught some of the flaws. Hearing that felt like someone had pulled a rug from under me. All that time we'd trusted the house more than we should have. As night fell, the smell of burnt wood lingered in the air long after the last firefighter truck left. Neighbors stopped by throughout the evening, bringing blankets, offering their guest rooms, sharing stories of old wiring issues they'd ignored. One of them pointed out that everyone was dragging their heaters out of storage now that the temperatures had dropped, and you could see the worry settle across the whole street. Our house had always blended into the neighborhood, just another family home with a trimmed lawn and a squeaky front gate. Now it stood there blackened and marked, like a warning carved into the block. I remember sitting on the back of a pickup someone loaned us, staring at the charred frame and trying to imagine how close we'd come to not making it out. We stayed with relatives for a while, sorting through what could be salvaged and what was gone for good. Even now, I still find myself thinking about that crooked outlet, the one I walked past 1,000 times without giving it a second look. The experience changed the way I see simple things. Old cords, dusty heaters, strange noises in the walls. None of it feels minor anymore. The house was eventually torn down, and a new one stands there now. But every fall when the air turns sharp and people start pulling heaters from storage, I can't help but feel a quiet tension settle in. I don't fully understand how everything lined up the way it did, but we survived, and that's the part I hold on to. A stretch of cool air moving through the neighborhood pushed me to finally switch on the heater that morning, and that's when I learned it wasn't kicking in at all. Work had been hectic around that time, so having the house drop to that uncomfortable chill only added to the stress. I lived alone back then, in a place that wasn't big but had a certain quiet charm, especially when the leaves had just started turning. Calling a repair service felt like the obvious move, and I didn't think twice about it. The man who showed up later that afternoon introduced himself as Eric, wearing a dark jacket with a stitched patch that looked official enough for me not to question it. He had this calm, almost overly practiced way of talking, the kind that makes you feel like you're interrupting a script he's memorized. He asked to head straight to the basement to look at the unit, moving with a steady confidence like he'd been there 100 times. The basement in my house was one of those older ones, low ceiling, pipes running along the walls, and a faint mineral smell that came out strongest on damp days. While he worked, I stayed upstairs listening to the intermittent clangs and metallic scraping drifting through the vents. After about 20 minutes, he came back up, brow creased, saying the whole internal assembly was shot and needed an immediate replacement. It sounded dramatic, but I didn't know much about heaters, and his tone made it feel urgent. He showed me a handwritten estimate on a clipboard, the numbers stacked in a way that didn't leave much room for negotiation. I agreed to the deposit because the temperature was dropping and I didn't want to deal with the house getting colder overnight. After he left, I remember feeling relieved, thinking the worst part was over. But that same evening, I noticed the small ceramic bowl I always kept next to the front door wasn't there anymore. It wasn't valuable, just something I'd picked up at a street fair. But I'd kept my keys in it for years and knew exactly where it belonged. At first, I assumed I'd moved it without thinking, maybe set it somewhere weird while multitasking. I looked around casually and told myself I'd misplaced it, brushing it off as just me being distracted. The next night, when I was heading to bed, I saw that the basement door was slightly open, not wide, but just enough for the darkness behind it to form a thin strip along the frame. I knew I had shut it earlier. The latch was old but still reliable, and I never left it unlatched because drafts from the basement could chill the entire house. I pushed it closed with my foot and stood there for a moment listening to the house settle. There wasn't any noise coming from downstairs, no creaking steps, no shifting pipes, nothing that would give away movement. Still, something gnawed at me, a slow unease that settled beneath my ribs. It didn't feel dramatic enough to call anyone about, but it bugged me the rest of the night. 2 days later, I came home from work and immediately sensed that another item was missing. A small flashlight I kept in a drawer by the kitchen. I used it often enough to know exactly where it belonged, and I hadn't touched it since the week before. That was the moment a strange pattern started forming in my mind. None of the missing things had real monetary value, but they were objects I used, items whose absence I would definitely notice. I checked the basement door again that night and found it unlocked, the latch resting loosely like someone had tried not to make a sound. I stood there longer than I intended, letting the stale air drift up toward me. The silence in the house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were paying attention. I called the number the technician had given me, thinking maybe he'd stopped by without telling me, though that made little sense. The call went straight to a voicemail that didn't mention any company name, just a brief message from a man who sounded half asleep. I hung up before leaving anything. After that, I searched for the business online, typing the name he'd written on the carbon copy invoice. Nothing came up. Not a website, not an address, not even a listing buried in some outdated directory. That was when a cold realization crept deeper into my thoughts. I'd let a complete stranger roam my basement without verifying a single thing about him. That night I pushed a chair against the basement door before going to sleep. Not because I really thought it would stop someone, but because it felt like something tangible I could control. I woke up around 3 in the morning to a sound that was too soft to identify. It wasn't footsteps or voices, more like a faint shifting of air, the kind you hear when someone moves cautiously in another room. I lay still, trying to figure out whether the noise came from inside the house or outside. Eventually the sound faded, but the uneasiness stayed with me long after the house went quiet again. When I checked the basement door later that morning, the chair was slightly angled away from where I'd left it. I contacted a real HVAC company that afternoon, one with an actual storefront and licensed workers. The technician who arrived, a guy named Marcus, looked over my system and told me nothing needed replacing. Just a simple ignition issue, fixed in under 30 minutes. When I showed him the invoice the other man had left, he lifted an eyebrow and said he'd never heard of that company in his entire career. He also pointed out something I hadn't been paying attention to. The metal casing on the side of the unit had fresh scuff marks, like someone had pried at it without knowing what they were doing. He asked if the previous guy had spent a long time down there, and I felt my throat tighten as I admitted I hadn't checked on him once. I spent the rest of that day walking from room to room, noticing tiny details I had overlooked before. A window in the laundry room was unlatched. A rug near the back door was shifted just slightly, its corner bent in a way I would never leave it. None of it screamed danger on its own, but together it painted a picture I didn't want to admit I was seeing. When the sun went down, the house slipped into that dim, early fall darkness that seems to arrive too quickly. I turned on every light I could, trying to push back the uneasy feeling creeping through the hallways. Every shadow felt deliberate, every sound too precise to be just the house settling. The breakthrough came later that evening when I checked the basement again. Something told me to grab a flashlight and take a real look, not just peek from the top of the stairs like I'd been doing. The air down there felt cooler than usual, and the faint hum of the furnace made the silence feel even more unnatural. When I reached the far corner, I noticed a small patch of the wall where dust had been disturbed, like someone had leaned against it. Nearby, behind a stack of boxes, I found a single leather glove. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't old. That discovery sent a ripple through me, clarifying everything I'd been dancing around. Someone had been coming and going through that basement after the fake technician left. The final confirmation came when the police ran the name and number from the invoice. Neither belonged to a real business. The officer I spoke with told me they'd seen similar reports in nearby areas. Someone posing as a technician during the first cold spell of the season, using the basement access to quietly check layouts of homes. Small items disappearing was typical, he said, a way for the intruder to gauge how attentive the homeowner was. Hearing that made something click, the unlocked doors, the shifted chair, the noises in the night. He advised me to change every lock in the house and install a deadbolt on the basement door immediately. I didn't hesitate for a second. The new locks went on that same evening, and I've never scheduled maintenance work the same way again. Every company gets vetted, every technician confirmed before I let them near the property. After the locks were replaced, the strange disturbances stopped completely. No more missing items, no more unlatched doors, no more sounds drifting through the vents at night. I don't know what the intruder planned to come back for, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. What stays with me most is the thought of how close I came to letting something far worse unfold right under my nose. Even now, whenever the first cold snap rolls in, I can't help but think back to that week and how a routine service call nearly became something much darker. My overnight shifts at a small supermarket had settled into a weird kind of routine by late November, the kind where the dark feels heavier each night, and the silence starts to sound like it has weight. I'd been working there long enough to know every hum of the refrigerators and every flicker from the old lights near the dairy aisle. The building sat on the edge of a quiet commercial strip, And once the last customer left, the temperature inside always dipped fast, no matter how high we pushed the heater. That night, I remember walking in with a thermos of coffee and thinking the place felt colder than usual, the kind of cold that clings to the metal shelves and hangs around your breath. My job was simple enough: restock the items from the pallets delivered earlier in the evening, and make sure the aisles were ready for the morning rush. I didn't mind the solitude. It usually gave me space to think, and the emptiness made the hours pass in a strangely peaceful way. Aisles 12 and 13 were part of my rotation for that shift, the sections with cleaning supplies and paper goods. They always smelled faintly like detergent, and for some reason that smell made the whole store feel slightly less abandoned. I'd just finished lining up the last row of bleach bottles, stepping back to make sure everything was straight, when I felt this odd draft slip past me. Not threatening, just unexpected, like someone opened a freezer door nearby. I brushed it off because drafts in that place were nothing new. The building was old, and the insulation wasn't great. After that, I scanned the rest of the aisle, didn't see anything strange, and pushed my cart toward the break room to check the clipboard with the delivery times. Everything looked exactly how it should have looked at that hour. Quiet, empty, still. When I got to the break room, the delivery log said a truck was supposed to arrive earlier than scheduled. Store policy said I had to check the exterior cameras and confirm they were pulling up before going outside. I typed in the system password, clicked over to the live feeds, and leaned closer to the monitor, because the screen always had this dusty haze no matter how many times we wiped it. The loading dock camera looked normal. No headlights, no movement, just an empty stretch of asphalt. When I switched to the interior feed that covered aisles 12 and 13, a shape caught my eye. A tall figure stood between the rows, not close enough to the camera to show detail, but solid enough to be unmistakably human. At first I thought it was a glitch. Old systems like ours glitch all the time. But the outline didn't flicker or distort. It just stood there. I stared for a long moment, trying to make sense of how someone could be in that aisle when I had literally been standing there minutes earlier. Alone. I toggled between angles trying to get a clearer view, and that's when it moved. Not smoothly or naturally, more like the figure shifted positions only when the camera switched frames, appearing a little closer each time but never in the act of actually walking. The moment the feed changed again, the shape wasn't centered anymore. It leaned into the blind spot created by one of the support beams, as if it knew exactly where the camera's reach ended. I remember feeling this strange pressure in my chest, not panic, but the kind of tension you get when you sense you're not alone, even though everything around you insists you should be. I clicked through every angle the system offered, hoping one of them would catch a full view of whatever was standing there, but the thing kept slipping away like it was deliberately staying hidden. That was the moment I realized I couldn't sit in that break room and pretend the building was empty anymore. I grabbed the flashlight we kept in the supply drawer, even though the aisles were fully lit, and stepped back onto the floor. The cold felt sharper now, almost like the air had dropped another few degrees while I was in the break room. The store was so quiet that every sound I made echoed slightly. My steps, the faint rattle of keys on my belt, even the hum of the lights overhead seemed louder. When I turned into the main aisle that cut across the store, I tried to convince myself I'd probably see nothing out of place. Maybe the camera had picked up my reflection earlier, or maybe a stray display sign had tipped just right to look human from a distance. But as I walked closer to aisles 12 and 13, something about the silence felt heavier, like the building was holding its breath. The lights down at that end flickered once, just a soft dip, but enough to make the aisle look deeper than it usually did. Aisle 12 was empty when I stepped in, exactly how I'd left it. The rows of bleach bottles stood perfectly lined, and the floor was clean except for a faint scuff mark near the shelves that definitely hadn't been there before. It looked like the kind of mark made by a shoe, one dragging step, not a full stride. I bent down to run my hand near it, more out of curiosity than anything else, and noticed something else at the far end of the aisle. A small stack of neatly folded clothes sat right at the corner, placed as if someone had taken their time arranging them. The shirt on top still had a store tag attached. I hadn't seen that stack earlier. I would have noticed something that deliberate, especially right in my path. My throat tightened a little as I looked around, expecting someone to step out, but the aisle stayed still, the overhead lights buzzing faintly like they were the only things awake in the entire building. I backed out of the aisle and checked the other end where aisle 13 started, and sure enough, there was another stack. This time a pair of jeans folded so precisely it almost looked staged for a display. But we didn't keep stacks like that at the ends of aisles. Everything was supposed to stay inside the shelves. I kept turning my head, scanning each direction, hoping to catch even the slightest movement. The store suddenly felt much larger, every shadow stretching farther than it should. I tried calling out a simple, "Hello," even though my voice sounded too loud in the emptiness. No answer. The chills running through the place weren't from the cold anymore. They came from the sense that someone had been walking right behind me the entire time, staying just out of sight, slipping through gaps I didn't even notice. I stepped toward the front end of the aisle to check the camera blind spot I'd seen on the monitors. It was a narrow angle between two tall shelving units, just wide enough for someone to stand if they pressed their back against the metal. As I approached it, the lights above me dimmed again for half a second, like the power was struggling to keep up with the temperature drop. My footsteps slowed. Halfway down, a sound broke the silence, fabric shifting, like someone brushing against clothing. I stopped and listened, heart thumping in my ears, but the sound didn't repeat. When I reached the blind spot, it was empty. No person, no footprints, no sign anyone had been there except for another small pile of clothes folded with the same unsettling care. And that's when a thought hit me. Someone had been in the store for hours, maybe since before we locked up, using every gap in the cameras to move the same way I walked my stalking routes. The idea made the hairs on my neck rise, and suddenly, the quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like something was watching, choosing exactly when to stay hidden. I pulled my phone from my pocket, debating whether it made sense to call for backup or if I was overreacting to some prank or mistake in stalking. Before I could decide, a faint tapping echoed from somewhere near the frozen foods section. 3 soft, steady clicks, like someone tapping a nail against metal. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the empty aisles in a way that felt deliberate. I turned toward the sound and started walking, holding the flashlight even though the lights were still on. Each aisle I passed seemed colder than the one before it, and the further I went, the more convinced I became that whoever was moving around in there knew the building better than I did. The tapping stopped the moment I reached the freezers, leaving nothing but the hum of the compressors vibrating through the floor. I stood there scanning the stretch of glass doors and caught my reflection staring back, a reflection that looked more tense than I expected. Right then, the overhead speaker crackled. It was the faintest static, a soft burst like someone had lightly brushed the microphone. Nobody was in the control room. Nobody should have been anywhere near the intercom system. I stepped backwards slowly, watching the ceiling as if the speaker itself might move. Another low burst of static slipped through, this one lasting a little longer, almost enough to sound like a breath. I whispered a quick, "Who's there?" without thinking, and the silence that followed felt unnaturally complete. The kind of silence where even the normal store sounds seemed to shrink away. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and forced myself to walk toward the front registers where I had a clearer view of most aisles. If someone was hiding, I wanted to catch them crossing the open floor. No more guessing, no more blind spots. Halfway to the registers, I heard something I still can't explain. Clothing rustling, but not the subtle kind. This was like someone rifling through a whole pile of garments at once. The sound came from aisles 9 and 10, a place I'd stalked earlier in the night that had been perfectly organized before I moved on. I turned the corner and found several more folded stacks placed deliberately across the aisle floor, each spaced about 6 feet apart. Shirts, pants, even a jacket that looked like it had been laid out for someone to change into. None of it belonged on that aisle. My pulse thudded in my ears as I scanned every shelf, every corner, expecting a person to jump into view, but the aisle was empty from end to end. The only movement came from a long piece of plastic wrapping drifting gently near a shelf, as if someone had brushed past it seconds before I arrived. I didn't waste time pretending it was a misunderstanding anymore. I turned around and headed straight for the office to call the police. The walk felt twice as long as usual, like the store had stretched itself out. With every step, I expected to hear footsteps behind me or see a shadow slip across the tiles. Nothing happened, but the sense of being guided, herded almost, followed me the whole way. When I shut the office door behind me, the thin wooden panel felt far too flimsy to be any real protection. I dialed emergency services, gave them the address, and made it clear I wasn't alone in the building. The operator told me to stay put, and while I waited, I watched the store monitors again. This time, the tall figure appeared in a different aisle, closer to the front, leaning just enough into frame to make its presence undeniable. The moment the cameras cycled, it slipped out of sight again. I sat there gripping the edge of the desk, counting the seconds until help arrived, knowing I wouldn't set foot back on that floor alone.